and I'm sure others will be catching up with us this morning. So good morning all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas, the facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Housing Actions Work Group. Glad to see you all here on this sort of nice August morning. So let's start as we always do with a round of introductions, and then I will go over the agenda and then we can launch into our program. But glad you all are here. Thea, do you want to kick us off for DLCD staff?
Sure, yeah. Hi all, Thea Croman, housing planner, go by she, her pronouns, and I'm here in the housing division at DLCD. Really glad to see you all here. It's been a while, and it occurred to me as I was sort of looking at our schedule that this is our second to last, it's our penultimate AUG meeting. And I, just as I was reflecting, really want to appreciate all of the time and work that has gone into this project, and appreciate you all for continuing to show up and work through this with us. So just wanted to say that at the top. I will pass it to my colleague Ingrid.
Did you say Ingrid, Thea? Sorry. Good morning, everyone. Ingrid Cordell, Administrative Specialist for the Housing Division, DLCD, and I'll pass it on to Mari.
Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Mari Valencia Aguilar, she, they pronouns, housing planner here at the department. Sean, take it away.
Sean Edging, housing planner at the Housing Accountability and Production Office, joining on to help with the model code work. I guess I will pass it on. Ethan, have you gone yet?
I have not. Thanks, Sean. Hey, everyone. Good morning. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I manage the housing division here at DLCD. Devin, I hand this back to you.
Thank you. And Kasaria, are you able to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Kasaria Taylor, Senior Rules Coordinator for DLCD.
Thank you, and sorry for mispronouncing your name again. All too common. Let's do a round of introductions. Oh, I'm sorry. My consultant colleague, Madeline, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Madeline Miller from Echo Northwest. I think my internet might be a little lagged, so I'm going to be turning off my video here, but part of the consultant team, and I'm here taking notes.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. Let's do introductions of the HOG members, and I'll, as always, just sort of try to do it in alphabetical order here by first name, starting with Anne.
Thank you. Good to be here. Anne Catlin, City of Albany.
Great, thank you. Ariel?
Hi, good morning. Ariel Kane, City of Portland.
Good to see you, Ariel. Brock?
Morning, Brock Nation, he, him, Policy Director, Oregon Realtors.
Thank you. Brianne?
Good morning, Brianne Gale, City of Bend.
Great. Karen?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Burig, Clackamas County.
Thanks. Not Madeline, sorry, Mac?
Hi, good morning. Sorry, just took a bite of breakfast, but I'll be on camera shortly.
Of course you did. All right. Glad you're here. Mary Kyle.
I'm Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon. I'm not going to be able to stay for the whole meeting, but I'll be here for a bit. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. Matt.
Yeah, this is Matt Sears. I'm with the Oregon Council on Developmental Disabilities.
Glad you're here. Rachel.
Morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Bidu. I'm with the Network for Oregon Affordable Housing.
Good morning. And Talia.
Hey, everyone. Talia Concrevish, she, her pronouns, with Oregon Housing and Community Services. And I also have an ongoing 11 o'clock meeting, so we'll dip out at that time. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you so much. Did I miss anyone? I think I got everyone. Okay.
Missed me, but
oh, I'm sorry, Julia. My apologies. I knew it was inevitable I would miss someone. Please.
All good. Julia Metz, she, her pronouns, and I'm with Sightline and 1000 Friends of Oregon. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for speaking up about that. Okay, I really don't. Anyone else? I'm not going to presume anymore. Okay, great. Mari, if you could pull up the slides, that would be great, please. Wonderful. So I believe you all know in detail that this meeting is primarily focused on reviewing and talking about the first draft of rules for all the elements that we've been discussing. There's 4 primary parts, and we have time for discussion sort of broken out for those 4 primary elements in the rules, which are the contextualized housing need, the rules related to model code, rules related to HPS action selection, and then the acceleration program refinements. And we're hoping to get your feedback and explore some areas for potential refinement, additional refinements to the draft rules, identify places where clarification or guidance would be really helpful, and flag opportunities in the rules to strengthen that. Thea, yes.
Oh, I was just noticing that one section in this agenda did not get updated, and I wanted to. So when we go through it, just note that 11:15 to 11:50 is actually for an acceleration program discussion. Not that much time for meeting reflections. I'm looking at.
Thank you for flagging that. I did not even notice that either. All right, Mari, if you could go to the next slide, and I'll just do a quick rundown of the ground rules one more time. So as always, we ask you to come prepared, and as always, you will show up very prepared to engage in the meeting. Don't hesitate to ask for assistance if you're having some technical difficulties. Ingrid is your person. You can chat her. And then just, ground rules for how we work together and collaborate on this conversation. We ask that you, of course, honor the agenda, speak one at a time, which is easy in this sort of environment. Allow for a balance of speaking time. Make sure you're acknowledging the folks who maybe are being a little quiet, but you'd really like to hear from, and we'd all like to hear from, and give them a little space. Please stick to addressing issues, not individuals. Listen with respect, and come into the room with a sense of wanting to learn from one another, and resolve differences, find common ground where there is some. But we are really here today to hear a wide variety of opinions and perspective on the draft rules, and look forward to hearing from you on that. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand it over to Thea to get us rolling.
Locating my mute button. So as always, we want to start with a reflection on the racial equity framework for decision making. This is a core part of the rulemaking process, and it's directed by our commission. And as we get closer to actually dialing in rules, we wanted to draw out 2 pieces that we think are really important to consider right now. I want to start with benefits and burdens. We've discussed this before, but I'll run through the specific questions. What are the benefits and burdens of this rule? Financial, environmental, or social? Who will benefit from this action, and who will be most burdened? How will burdens be mitigated, and how might benefits be redistributed? It asks us to identify possible unintended consequences. How would we mitigate those if we do find them later? And to analyze and consider the benefits and burdens to future populations as well as present populations. And I think this is an important moment to reflect on how well the rules respond to that set of questions. Also pulling out accountability. How does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? So what are the accountability measures that for local governments in this rule? How will DLCD track compliance? And how will DLCD track compliance, and what are the incentives and disincentives for not meeting that compliance? So this really, speaks very directly to sort of what we're talking about in terms of the compliance pathways. Do the accountability measures include engaging with communities? And if yes, how is this done? If no, why not? What are the challenges and opportunities for accountability for DLCD and local government, and what are some ideas to address this. So we'll be trying to weave these questions throughout the discussion, but really welcome and encourage you all to reflect on them yourselves and draw our attention to any areas that you see need more of a focus in order to respond to the racial equity framework for decision making, both in these specific categories or any of the others. So I think we can move on. All right, so jumping right in, given the limited time, we're just going to kind of get right into the meat of the amendments to Division 8. So you'll have seen that there are, in the document, there are a lot of minor adjustments, some sort of larger adjustments. We welcome feedback on all of those, but I want to emphasize that the discussion today is really only going to be focused on the compliance pathway structure and the rule language. So these other elements, definitely open to feedback. Hope you will give us feedback, but we don't have tons of time today, and we need to really stay within the HOG scope. So key to the design of this program is that it offers partial compliance. So it identifies compliance pathways for the key needs that you see listed here, but all other needs must be assessed at the local level via the existing rules, the existing CHN rules in OAR 660, Division 8, 075 in sections 2 to 4. That citation just outlines the existing rules for the CHN, and I really want to start there to emphasize that this is, what we're proposing here is just a slice of what the responding to the CHN looks like. A high-level reminder of what the CHN does. Just gonna pause here. I got a message. Ryzen Tower is actually Shannon. So Ingrid, go ahead and let her. Oh, Shannon, you're here. Yay. Okay.
Thanks. Ryzen Tower would be better. Thank you. So sorry. Weird update action.
I like it. I love the name.
It's great.
Okay, just a high-level reminder of what the contextualized housing need does. So after a city receives their housing target and allocation from DAS in the year of their HCA per the schedule, the CHN is a set of analyses that reveal nuanced housing need and fair housing issues in a city. Developing standardized need assumptions in the CHN, as we are doing here, has the potential to really push cities to be more ambitious. But we also want to acknowledge that if they're not calibrated correctly, they can also have the opposite of the intended effect or other sort of unintended consequences. So that's why you see a range of compliance tools that we're suggesting here in this version of the rules to address certain key issues. We can go to the next slide, Maddie. We'll start with the set of rebuttable presumptions. And again, rebuttable presumptions provide a baseline for the conclusions in the CHN, but they allow cities to demonstrate that an alternative assessment may more accurately identify housing need and provide a path for cities to rebut the suggestion here. So this approach really ensures a heavy level of program design incentive to follow this path, but it also allows local governments to deviate if they're willing to risk the legal certainty and really see a better and a more appropriate way to pursue that same assessment. So a key part of what we were thinking about when we developed these draft rules is that rather than identifying incremental increases based on current production, The state staff, us, we are proposing a rebuttable presumption that attempts to identify sort of an aggregate need across the state, like really looking at what the need is rather than what current production is. We've had this conversation as a group here before. Just want to emphasize that that's sort of how this is oriented. So for housing type mix, what this does is it allocates 40% of the production target for multi-unit need, 20 for middle housing. The disaggregation of the multi-unit and middle housing percentages is really important to ensure the outcomes of housing diversity to meet the intent of this compliance pathway and the ONA more broadly. The sort of ambitious level of the numbers acknowledge the connection between affordability and type without locking it in, but noting that the need for housing that is available at lower price points is really quite dire. I think that I'll leave that there for now. Just mention that the accessible need is set to align with the percentage of folks with ambulatory disabilities, again, rather than keying off current production levels, in order to move away from perpetuating the trends, the past trends, and pushing that into the future, which is a key tenet of the ONA. I think that is all I need to say here. We can definitely discuss more. Let's move to the next slide, Maddie. So there's a couple of safe harbors in here. Local governments essentially can adopt these provisions in Section 7 to reduce analytical burden and achieve certainty in the methods and conclusions of certain key housing needs. That is the purpose of a safe harbor. Because age is closely tied with the need for adaptable housing, it seemed a decent sort of metric for staff to tie to a safe harbor that provides basically a carrot for cities to use the elderly dependency ratio to establish a need assumption for adaptable housing as a safe harbor. That aligns with the goals of supporting aging in place and creating more flexible housing stock to address the lack of accessibility features and units in Oregon. But the data is broad, and we definitely wanted to leave open the possibility that if a city has really a more nuanced way to understand their adaptable need, the city is welcome to rely on that and address it via the existing rules. Section 7 also provides a way to establish conclusions for larger household housing needs. This is accomplished by relying on an element that's already a required input into the CHN. So looking at the housing equity indicators. So for both of these, the safe harbor has cities compare the regional and local data, and to proceed with the safe harbor track, they have to take the higher of those two estimates. We can go to the next slide, Maddie. All right, staff are also proposing that two key needs kind of fall outside of the rebuttable presumption and safe harbor categories. Locational need is really too varied and local and contextually specific to provide a standardized safe harbor. However, as you have seen, DLCD developed a statewide tool, the Community Assets and Farms Mapping Tool, that at this point has to be considered in the local analysis now as part of the base program. So the mapping tool is available to cities, and locational need can be interpreted via that tool to determine city-specific conditions. So it is guidance in terms of how a city uses that information, but it's a required input under the HPS program rules, along with all the other currently required data sources. Home ownership was elevated this legislative session by HB 2698, If you followed that, you'll know it adopted statewide home ownership goals. So these rules essentially simply refer to those goals, which are broken out by income bracket, and those can inform the CHN conclusion. Since they're already statutorily required statewide, they become a minimum standard in the base rules of the CHN. So both of these, the community assets and harms mapping tool and these statewide home ownership goals are not broken out into the compliance pathway section, but integrated into the base rules. I think that is where we can stop and jump into a discussion of the CHN.
Great, thank you. I should have mentioned at the top, and you probably gathered it from the agenda, that we'll go through each of these four major elements today with a bit of an overview presentation like Thea just gave, and then we'll have discussion. For this one, we'll go until about 9:50, so about 25 minutes. And let me just frame all of this for us. As a reminder, rulemaking must be focused on addressing the housing production and affordability crisis in Oregon through the lens of racial equity, housing needs of historically marginalized communities, the ONA framework of production affordability choice, the HOG policy objectives, and finally, local government staffing and budgetary capacities, and at times constrictions on their capacity. So with that, we can get into discussion in a moment, but first let me see, are there any clarifying questions about this section of rule or things that confused you as you were looking through it? And this section, I mean, starting on page 14 regarding the contextualized housing need. Brock, question?
Yeah, and then I'm going to keep my hand up for discussion piece as well. But for the additions in 75(1)(e), A through C, if those aren't achieved by a city during their HPS cycle, what is the consequence there? Oh, Thea, you're on mute.
Thank you for noticing that. Uh-oh.
Thanks, Brock. Took me a minute. Okay, so I'm navigating to this. 75(1) CE, you said?
1E, A through C, so it's the quantified housing type mix, the characteristic and location description quantified where possible, and then the home ownership goal, those three.
Oh, right. So this is not part of the compliance pathways work. I think that this was this is something that's related to the CowTAC, the HCA requirements. So it is required, but it's not part of this scope.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to get too distracted by it. I know that's a juicy piece.
Any other clarifications or quizzical bits about the rules before we get into discussion? Okay. So I'll put the two discussion questions on the table, and maybe someone can pop them in the chat if that's helpful. In light of the housing crisis and drawing on the issues I noted a moment ago, what's your perspective on the draft proposed administrative rules for compliance pathways for contextualized housing need assumptions? And as staff look to refine the contextualized housing need compliance rules, what racial equity opportunities and consequences need to be considered and or addressed? So go ahead, Brock.
Thank you. One, I'm not sure that having a specific quantified housing need is aligned with the definition of needed housing in 197A.0184B, because that requires determined housing type mixes to be appropriately responsive to current and projected market trends. When you have a city under 10,000 being required to do 60% multifamily and middle housing, that is potentially far beyond what their market is capable of producing. This goes directly against what was recommended by the consultants in ECO's compliance pathway memo. I do realize that this is a rebuttable presumption, but especially for small cities that are already going to struggle with this capacity of work, I think it's more likely that they are just going to default to saying, hey, you know what, this is fine. This is what they want us to do. We don't want to get this sent back to us. So we're just going to go with it, even if it's not necessarily right. The memo also specifically calls out if you overemphasize multi-unit and middle housing, you're going to risk underestimating overall land need and misalignment with the market, which means that you might not actually get the types that you need to produce there. And additionally, this does not work with the proposed definition of housing type that was added into Rule 5. I think it's either 26 or 27. And part of the reason for that is that, okay, when we say housing type is a category distinguished by physical form and underlying parcel of land, so is middle housing a type or is duplex a type? Are duplexes and triplexes different types because their form consists of 2 units versus 3 units? If it's a detached duplex and say they're smaller than 900 square feet, is it a duplex or is it a cottage cluster that is lacking an open community space? So I think one, that housing type definition needs to be removed from the proposal there. And two, again, you know, that this whole process is making sure that we are building for affordability, you know, with the types that match with that, right? But it needs to be responsive to local market trends. That's the only way that we're going to get out of this crisis. So strongly disagree with that. I would not recommend having a compliance pathway for type at all, but certainly not 4020 as proposed in the current draft rules.
Okay. Thea, some
yeah, I heard Brock and appreciate those comments and look forward to seeing that in writing too. I'm sure. I just want to, you know, really clarify, and I know you understand this too, but just because we're talking about it, these are not, you know, this is what a city is required to plan for. You know, they're not, and acknowledging that cities do not build this housing. This is, you know, just making space for it. It's overemphasizing where there is need, you know, providing greater capacity for these certain needed housing types. And so, you know, just want to make sure that we know what we're talking about. This is not a requirement that cities build 40%, you know, multifamily housing, regardless of whether or not that's the appropriate number. Just want to make sure that that's crystal clear.
Great. Thank you, Thea. Mac.
Yeah, thank you. I have a clarifying question first, also within the unit type, rebuttable presumption and so with that first, can you just confirm that the definition here that we're utilizing for multi-unit housing is 5 units or more, or is it a higher threshold?
Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. I believe it's 5 units or more.
Okay.
I think that's what ECHO was going with, and we, you know, although we deviated, you know, to some extent, that's kind of, we stuck with that model.
Okay. Yeah, with again grounding it in the fact that it's 5 units or more, I think is really helpful there. But one thing that I'm kind of interested in is I would love to hear a little bit more in terms of these sort of different pro rata buckets and shares that are being applied evenly across the state, why there was not a consideration of perhaps in larger cities or in minimum within the Portland metro of creating a second tier bucket of like 20 units. 20 unit plus for multi-unit, saying that again in the context of to achieve affordability a lot. And I've said this many times in this space, and sorry, we'll keep saying it, but the number one funder of affordable housing is going to be often through LIHTC. That needs a scale of a minimum of 40 units per site. And so making sure that there is compliance within that and identifying the need for that type of scale of development within a jurisdiction, particularly in those larger cities and in the metro region, which often can support that development type at that intensity level, I think would be really important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Brianne.
Thanks. Just kind of echoing some of, I think, Brock's comment, I was a little surprised, I guess, to see the rebuttable presumption mix based on Portland Metro plus 5%, if I was understanding that right, to be applied citywide. And then as far as, I think just as like for context, I guess a cumulative 60% of units having to be middle and multifamily, like Bend adopted in 2016, our cumulative total for those was 45%. And our actual that we're seeing built is closer to 42%. So I guess seeing like that for a cumulative total of those two unit types. And so I think putting that as a rebuttable presumption just really puts the city, like a big burden on the city to try and demonstrate why we can't meet that, and a big legal risk for us. Yeah. And then I did have some other comments, but I think we'll address them in different sections.
All right, thank you. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, so on this topic of the like 40% multi-unit versus 20% middle housing, I did want to say that I agree with the strong statewide stance that this section's taking, and also I think steering away from an incremental approach that perpetuates discrepancies that already exist is a good strategy. I also think that I agree with the disaggregating multi-unit and middle housing, and agree with relying on demographics and population data rather than just past production of things like accessible or adaptable housing. That's kind of around page 19. I think in some other sections, just kind of moving away from that, I wanted to mention 4 other things. First, in section 7, where it talks about the elderly dependency ratio, I think it's a clever tool to measure adaptable housing, but I think it should be a rebuttable presumption and not just a safe harbor. I also think it could be possible to look at the intersection of, like ACS or census data on aging, like the elderly population, and then that intersection with mobility impairments as perhaps being a more reliable number that you could base a rebuttable presumption on. So that's just one idea I wanted to put out there. And then I think, a third thing I wanted to mention is that with the focus on ambulatory disability under the accessible housing category, I guess I would encourage thinking about not just physical accessibility, but in terms of fair housing choice, trying to incorporate other aspects that reflect other types of disabilities like mental health or IDD. For example, the prevalence of adult foster homes in a city, or facilities of serving people with mental health. I think those are aspects of housing that right now the contextual housing need analysis doesn't really touch on, as far as I can tell. I think a fourth thing I wanted to mention is with the report under section 4B. I think another data point that's not really mentioned is some sort of an inventory of accessible and adaptable units. Now, that's a challenge right now, but I think, we're talking about plans that are going to be carried out over 10 to 20 years, or at least 8 years. So in that time period, we should be encouraging cities to develop tools to create more of a inventory of accessible and adaptable housing. I think section 4B could help encourage that. And then lastly, just briefly on equitable engagement, I would just mention that it does call out individuals with disabilities, and that's great. But just to be mindful that, again, within individuals with disabilities, there are lots of different types of disabilities. And so that public engagement or equitable engagement should probably involve, making sure that cities are accessing different stakeholder groups within the disability population.
that might be an area that could use some additional guidance for things to look for and how to keep those in mind. Thank you for all of that, Matt. And before we wrap up conversation, I'll ask staff if they have any questions or follow up for any of you. But let's keep going here. Anne, hi, good morning.
Good morning. Well, I support all the comments and share the same concerns as everyone that's already spoken. A few additional comments related to the safe harbor for housing mix. And I mean, we're a large city, but we don't see, 5-story development, for example. And that kind of ties into the accessible comment I was going to say, but given the need for homeownership, I mean, we don't have condos down here. I mean, that's just a rare form of homeownership. So when we're really looking at multiple goals and the types of housing units, we can achieve density still and a lot of housing with a variety of housing mix. And that's kind of what I say at almost every meeting. But the other thing I was going to mention is related to the larger household housing for larger households. We're putting into the rules the percentage of households in the cities which are family households. Well, the definition of family households at the census level, it's 2 or more related or unrelated. I mean, you need to look at the definition. So there will be a lot of family households in a city. So I think if we could focus on household size and thinking about if we need 3 and 4 bedroom units, that we're really looking at household size of 4 or more. And I mean, I guess we could do that, but with a rebuttable presumption. But we also need to steer away from using the term family in our rules. And then regarding the accessible and adaptable housing, I mean, all of the suggestions and things that we can do in actions. I mean, we're trying to do those locally, but we had a market analysis done, and I mean, we're probably not going to see 5-story development in Albany, and even in our highest density mixed use areas and climate friendly areas. And I mean, we might see some 5-story, but you don't necessarily have elevators in 4-story development. And I really appreciate what Matt said about other disabilities and the need for that type of housing, because those are really hard to make pencil. And yeah, I mean, it goes beyond just accessible too. So those are my comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thanks for the reminder that it's not just one rule in and of itself, but that layering of rules or goals where things start to get maybe very complicated. Julia.
Yeah, thank you. I first wanted to just say yay, because I saw that Public Works was added to the list of departments that cities are supposed to work with throughout all of this. And so that was a fantastic improvement. So thank you for adding that. Very key. Also just wanted to express again excitement that the mapping tool is being further developed in terms of kind of helping provide a little bit of guidance for areas of opportunity as well as harms or disamenities, and that I think that is using it as a guidance tool, I think is the right move there, just in terms of it being something for cities that maybe don't have the capacity or staff on board to kind of kickstart that, but also recognizing that there are limitations in terms of just reliability of data across the state on that. So I think that was a good move, and hoping that we get to kind of see maybe what's going into that in terms of inputs, just so we can both provide any feedback that's useful for that, but also just have that in the back of our head as we're providing comments on compliance pathways that might kind of refer to that, so that we can kind of know what that data is would be really helpful. This might be more in the HPS section, but because I am talking about location, I just wanted to bring up a couple things on that front. Hoping we eventually maybe get to circle back to the conversation around areas of risk of displacement and how that relates to some of the compliance pathways in association with location, since that was something that the EGO memo had called out and I wasn't seeing reflected in the rules so far. And then just similarly kind of contemplating how distribution of types of housing by way of zoning types is reflected throughout all of this. Again, kind of, I know that thread is there, but just really wanting to make sure that we're contemplating both, is the supply or yeah, the supply of existing zones correct, first of all, which I know happens kind of in the BLI and HCA part of this, but then where they are located, is that correct? Are we seeing equity issues where current zoning is located? Do we need to see expansions of certain types of zoning to support certain types of housing in certain parts of the city? And I'm still kind of struggling to truly see that thread carried all the way through. I know that was called out in the commentary a few times as like the intent is there, but I'm not kind of seeing the dots fully connected all the way through the process. I'm hoping that can be to me, that's an equity conversation that I just want to make sure we're having. Then excuse me, sorry, fighting a little bit of a cold or something this morning. On the homeownership targets, I apologize, I'm not as familiar with the bill that went through this session, but I'm just wondering if you can confirm, if I was reading this correctly, that the intent is that the state assigns targets for homeownership, but then ONA is saying, in terms of what you've proposed in the rules, that then that overall target will be equally distributed across income levels as defined by ONA, and those income levels being the 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60. Okay. So I definitely want to hear from affordable housing developers on this, but I have a little bit of a concern around an equal distribution across income levels for homeownership. Not because I don't think we should be trying to provide opportunities for wealth building across income levels, but just there's a reality of a true need, skew, and opportunity, maybe just slightly higher up the scale than 0 to 30. So I get a little nervous if we equally distribute into that 0 to 30, then we're taking away opportunities from folks in the 30 to 60, for example. So still in that affordable homeownership realm, but again, I think that there should be some in that 0 to 30, but just the equal terminology was making me a little uncomfortable. And I'm glad Shannon raised her hand because I really wanted to hear from Shannon on this topic. So just flagging that, I don't know what the right solution is. And then lastly, I just wanted to note in terms of kind of the references within the compliance pathway in this, I like the idea of referring to equity indicators. So we're kind of completing the ONA, cross reference here. And as has already happened, I wanted to defer to others in terms of what is the right indicator to refer to. So I'm already hearing some, suggestions around accessibility, which I think is good. I also had the question around family households that Anne brought up. So I like that reference to equity indicators since that's part of the ONA family, but let's make sure they're useful and they're getting us to the right place. So thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And Garland, if you could just hold on a minute, I'd like to just kind of pull the thread just a little bit more about the homeownership target distribution. Shannon and Thea, I saw you come off mute. Maybe you want to, sorry, Thea, maybe you have something more to say before I move on here.
Actually, I was just going to say, I have to pull up that bill. I nodded when you said is it equally distributed. I actually don't, I'm not totally positive. I cannot recall offhand what the distribution looks like. So just don't want to put my foot in my mouth, but I think Shannon does know.
Well, and to clarify, I guess I was asking both, is it the bill that's saying to do that, or which I didn't think it was. I think what you put into the ONA rules was what was saying that part. And so that was kind of then me kind of pushing back on that a little bit if it's not required by the bill, which I'm seeing lots of nodding from people who I think know.
Yeah, I think the intention of the rule is to align with the bill. So if there's, if there's some language tweak that needs to happen, that I think that that definitely can. I think the point is just to basically adopt the same scheme.
Right, Shannon, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Although I'm super curious what Garland and Brock are going to say too. So go team. So the bill is tracking homeownership rates. It's not specifying about associated income ranges of the home buyers. It does on the tracking disaggregates also by race and ethnicity, just so we can see how we're doing with serving underserved communities over time, and by county. And that's going to be a dashboard that Oregon Housing and Community Services is maintaining. So it will always be available to look at how we're doing. It will be measured over time. And yeah, I think I'll just pause because, again, I think Garland and Brock have a lot to contribute to this conversation too.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Garland, please, could you introduce yourself too? You missed intros earlier. Thank you.
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Garland Woodsong. I'm the Executive Director of Place Initiative and the President of the Oregon Cooperative Housing Network. And I also run the planning consultancy Woodsong Associates. So I wanted to jump in here and offer my 2 cents that I believe the rebuttable presumption goals for multi-unit middle housing and accessible housing are actually a good start and are headed in the right direction. If cities are currently struggling to meet production percentages close to those goals, that's fine. That just means we all have work to do. To date, we actually have not seen the type of work done that would be needed to truly facilitate production at levels similar to those numbers. For instance, we have not seen small developer incubators to recognize that development of 2 to 4 unit homes was illegal for much of the 20th century and much of the beginning of the 21st century due to single family zoning rules, which rendered this class of developer near extinct. To counteract that, we need active efforts to be made to recultivate this sector, including training small developers through incubators and boot camps, providing pathways to access financing for this development type, cultivating the ecosystem of supportive actors for this sector, and removing barriers to this type of development, including parking requirements and limitations on FAR that can prevent developments from penciling for market rate small developers. We also need to see greater facilitation for the development of cooperative housing, including provisions for greater access to financing for this sector in order to grow the development of multifamily beyond what can currently be provided by market rate and or tax credit affordable rentals. So, it's that this is why we set goals. We don't set goals that are equal to current production levels. That would be silly. We set goals that are meant to be ambitious yet achievable. Once we set those goals, then we need to also deliver a toolbox of strategies that allows everyone in the state to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Garland. Appreciate that. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just quickly note one, yet achievable is the operative term in making sure that we're setting ambitious goals. Everything Shannon said about the homeownership goal bill, absolutely correct. Looking at page 21 of the Eco Northwest memo, they break down homeownership rates by income group. So over 100%, right? Currently around 73% of people are homeowners, or 73% of households are homeowners if they're making above 100% AMI. But once you get down even just into that 80 to 100 range, it drops to a little over 53%. 50 to 80, it starts dropping into the mid 40s. 30 to 50, you're into the mid 30s. So Julia is absolutely correct that, like, yes, we absolutely want everyone to have the opportunity to become a homeowner, but realistically, most of what that is going to look like in terms of being able to achieve this goal is going to be producing homes that are affordable, particularly in that like 80 to 100% range. And, even in this doesn't align perfectly with the income brackets for ONA, but that 60 to 80% range as well for kind of the more like deeply affordable home ownership, I suppose. So yeah, that's what I would say with that. Additionally, there's not specific teeth in this. So like if you don't hit your target, you're going to get slapped on the wrist, right? But it's just saying like, hey, keep trying to push for this. And the other thing I would say is that it sets a goal, but it doesn't set a cap. So if we're saying, oh, okay, we could increase, middle income home ownership by 20%, right? That's still great. And that's actually going to help you get more towards that overall goal for each 5-year period. So yes, I agree with Julia and agree with Shannon on that.
All right. Thank you. Mary Kyle.
Thank you. Just on the rebuttable presumptions, the compliance pathway rebuttable presumptions for multi-unit housing in medium and large cities. Fine with the percentages to have a goal, recognizing, as Thea said, doesn't mean it's actually necessarily all going to be built, but to have that goal. I am concerned though that it's limited to the existing zones that already allow multi-unit housing in the cities and because that is devoid of a locational analysis. And there are some cities that don't have a lot of multifamily zoned land currently. And it's also in places that they may have been zoned 40 years ago for reasons to put it out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And so I'm concerned that that's not meeting the locational equity, accessibility in terms of accessible to things people need to get to most days needs. So I understand it as a compliance pathway, rebuttable presumption, but I wouldn't want it to stand alone if the contextualized housing need and other things show that the existing zoning isn't in quantity or location sufficient.
Okay, thank you. And I think that was pulling the thread that Julia had started as well. Appreciate it. Shannon, I'm going to give you the last word on this topic and then move us along in the agenda. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to point out that the homeownership goal, a little further context there in case it's useful. The census data, it also accounts for co-op home ownership, condo home ownership, manufactured dwelling home ownership as counting. And I just think that further context may be helpful when we think about those different AMI targets. It's really hard to create a new manufactured home development, right? I think co-ops and condos though, and again, just like a slight celebration, we did have some pretty significant condo defect liability reform. So to earlier comments, we're working hard to try to make it less risky, more feasible to develop condos in the state, which maybe helps us get that AMI down a little further over time. So just, and really, I mean, Garland and team, like, there is some really exciting work in the Lane County area around co-op, very affordable co-op development. So those things are not, we don't all have the capacity to bring that to scale statewide yet. But I like to envision that future. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for pointing out some of the other homeownership opportunities or models that are available, but maybe are nation at this point. Before I move us on, I just want to give DLCD staff a moment to clarify, ask any questions of clarification of any comments you heard. I know you all can follow up with folks as well, but is there anything in particular you want to ask about this before we move?
There was a lot in there and really great suggestions and points. I don't want to spend too much time digging in right now, but definitely want to I'll review these notes carefully and follow up if I have questions specifically, and obviously encourage you all to reach out in writing or for a one-on-one kind of conversation too.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Thea. So moving on to the discussion number 2 regarding the rules for enacting the model code, and I'm going to hand it to Sean.
Great, thanks. And just a quick tag on to Shannon's comment on the condo liability reform. I am somebody who did just buy something that's technically a condo because it doesn't qualify for a middle housing land division because the lot's too small, so you can't break out the utilities. It's good. I will say when I was signing the documents, I'm like, man, the liability window is going to be a little bit shorter. I'm taking a little bit more risk, but it's still good. It's still good public policy. But yeah, I'll dive into more on the model code side of the administrative rulemaking. Just so we kind of cap off from where we left off before our quote unquote break, which for us really just meant contract amendment time. We had delivered kind of an initial draft of the model code in mid-June that we kind of discussed on this work group. We had great feedback that came from all of our different work group members, and of course a lot of follow-up feedback that happened. I'm sure you guys saw the email from us a couple of weeks ago around kind of kicking off a process where we are reaching out basically to local governments and developers to solicit different kind of examples of site plans for calibration of the model code and incorporating different provisions that came in from the 2025 session, including 2138, 974, those types of things. Yeah, please, Madi, please feel free to share the PowerPoint. Yeah, so basically we're kind of continuing with that refinement of that code. We'll be delivering, another draft of that or a refined draft of that as part of kind of LCDC's packet for the public comment, public hearing. We're hard at work on that. But in the meantime, one of the things that I kind of needed to get together to help facilitate the, adoption as we are required to do in Senate Bill 1564 is a series of rules that kind of operationalize the different statutory components of how the model code functions, and how it's used in different contexts, including, how Senate Bill 1564 prescribes how it's done, how it's going to be used for HAPO and aiding local housing compliance, and of course, how it's going to be used in the broader Goal 10 paradigm and program. And so basically these rules are just kind of a first iteration to kind of talk about some of those parameters to clarify, like, how can this be used and what context can it be used? How does it interact with other types of local land use regulations, things like that. And I'll kind of walk through kind of the high levels of each of them. And of course, we can set some time for questions and discussion as we get into this. So this section of rule, initially I'd kind of drafted it as a gigantic rule that did a lot of things. And I was like, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so, we kind of decided it would make sense to break it out into prescribe individual rules for specific functions that the model code had. And so this resulted in a total of 7 different kind of individual rules, each with their own kind of function. The first 2, purpose and definitions, I'm not going to cover. I mean, they're pretty straightforward pieces of the rule, but I do want to talk more about the actual functional provisions of the code, starting at 410 and ending at 430. If we can move to the next slide. So 410 and 415 are really all about kind of operationalizing or implementing the direction that was provided to LCDC in Senate Bill 1564, right? It required LCDC to adopt model ordinances that local governments, or specifically cities, can adopt and apply in whole or in part, optionally. And so these 2 rules really kind of get at operationalizing that direction. 410 is the rule that actually contains the model ordinances, right? So in order for them to have any function under statute, and of course to fulfill the legislative direction, they have to be adopted as an attachment to the rules. So 410 does that. 410 also kind of prescribes some general parameters around how they function, where they can be applied, how they intersect with other, say, applicable local land use regulations, goal protections, other modules. So the code's kind of divided into individual parts. So how do they speak to one another, right? To basically kind of clarify, how the code actually functions overall. And then once you get into 415, this kind of optional adoption and application by reference, right? This was that function that we talked about, right? This is going to be a resource, especially for small cities without a lot of resources or capacity to do code work of their own, to basically, optionally kind of adopt and apply these codes by reference. And this rule kind of clarifies how that's done. Where can you apply this? How can you apply this? How does it intersect with other local land use regulations that might be on the books? And of course, what's the kind of process for, keeping this up to date, things like that. And so there's a lot just kind of clarified in those different rules about clarifying basically their function to ideally support a small city in, optional adoption and application by reference. Of course, this option's open for larger cities as well, though we expect that to be kind of less often the case because they have more resources to kind of do the code work necessary to, operationalize, the pieces that they want to see in there. So if we can move to the next slide. There's another provision in rule that really relates to kind of HAPO model code as a tool for compliance with housing laws. So as you guys know, Senate Bill 1537 established our office, the Housing Accountability and Production Office, and it provided a lot of kind of different duties and direction to our office to really aid local implementation and compliance with housing laws. It's a big part of our job, and really a big part of our job is kind of leading with technical assistance and really trying to facilitate voluntary compliance with housing laws wherever we identify a potential or actual violation. And so what this rule is intended to do is to kind of help aid that implementation at the local level. We know that there are a lot of different laws that have passed, some of which, local governments have implemented, some of which they haven't implemented, some that are new, right? So are going to take time to implement. And this puts basically every jurisdiction at some range of conforming to not conforming with different state housing laws. And so one of the functionalities that we've kind of operationalized here is an existing statute that basically says, hey, if you are a local government and you have codes that are not conforming with current law, basically you can apply the statute directly to local land use decisions, right? So what this rule does is basically say, okay, as part of that, where we adopt model ordinances to comply with housing laws. Say a good example that's in this model code is actually middle housing land divisions, which changed from 2138. So we're going to be updating that to conform with 2138. And we're going to be publishing this in December. So what this basically enables a local government to do is to apply any of these modules to, a situation where they would otherwise violate a housing law, and basically use the model code as if they're applying the statute directly. So it provides an option for local governments, if they choose to, that they can use any module that we provide in these model ordinances to comply with a housing law. It's an option. It doesn't prevent them from otherwise, amending their codes to comply with housing laws, or if they choose, applying the statute directly, but it's intended to provide an option there that is intended to aid local implementation. Obviously, middle housing land divisions is one that we're going to expect to be pretty big and popular once we publish this in December. But we actually expect to add additional modules over time to deal with different housing laws. Some that we know are going to be kind of near-term needs or modules for mandatory adjustments in Senate Bill 1537, as well as the various by right affordable housing statutes that we know kind of exist. Things like ORS 197A 445, 460, things like that. And so, yeah, the intent is to build on this over time and to provide that option for local government compliance. If we can move to the next slide. These two rules are really focused on kind of that intersection with the Goal 10 program writ large. This rule 0425, as we'll kind of talk about, or as Thea will kind of cover in other, kind of components that are going to be discussed later on, there's going to be times where in Goal 10 implementation, either in the housing production strategy or in the housing acceleration agreement, where the model code is kind of used as a benchmark for compliance, right? So it might be, say, maybe, for example, in the housing acceleration program, we identify kind of restrictive code elements that really makes a particular housing type very difficult to build. And that's a barrier that we need to address. One of the actions that we can do is basically fix the code to make it more conducive to housing development. And there can be different provisions that apply that kind of apply the model code as a benchmark. And so what this rule does, it doesn't clarify precisely what that works. That's really kind of, Thea's and Celestina's job in terms of how the HPS and the Housing Acceleration Program works. But basically what this rule clarifies is when the model code is used as a benchmark, and we've talked about this before, it's not prescribing the specific standards that a local government has to apply. Like, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as what's provided in the model code. But basically what it does is it provides this option to apply local development standards, provided they achieve similar outcomes, right? So if we're thinking about the siting standards, it's not that you have to use, say, for example, FAR, which we've talked about a lot on this work group, but that you achieve kind of a similar building envelope or intensity, right, with the locally applied standards. Or that if you apply, say, design standards, they have kind of a similar cost imposed to development proportional to, the public benefits that they achieve, things like that. And of course, zoning use regulations and of course, other local standards don't create unreasonable cost or delay to the provision of that housing. Basically, the idea is that when it's used as a benchmark, it's a benchmark, not a prescription. And then finally, this last rule is about mandatory application. So this one is also outlined in statute. LCDC, kind of at the very tail end of the housing acceleration process, if there isn't kind of compliance with either a housing acceleration agreement or willingness to enter one, LCDC has this obligation to issue an enforcement order to ensure compliance. And one of the tools that they have in their tool belt in ORS 197335 is the application mandatorily of model codes and model procedures to housing development, right? And basically what this rule clarifies is like, all right, when that happens, how does this work? How does mandatory application of these model codes work once LCDC issues that enforcement order and kind of talks about, the superseding of local development ordinances. And of course that, applicants have the ability to choose between local standards versus a model code. Kind of functions a little bit like a developer's remedy once LCDC issues that enforcement order. And of course, sunsets once a local government comes back into compliance. So that's basically how this rule's written. Of course, it's pretty nascent. I imagine there's going to be a lot of components that need refinement before we actually get to the final rule adoption. But it's, that's basically a summary of how it goes. So we can move into discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. So let me just roll out the discussion questions and then we can do clarifying questions and discussion together. So questions, what's your perspective on the draft proposed administrative rules for enacting the model code? The model code only regulates some components of development and generally defers to local land use regulations for aspects of development it does not address, as Sean just laid out. Because there are other kinds of regulation that substantially impact development, such as tree codes or public works, how should the compliance pathways best address regulatory provisions not currently addressed in the model code? And then as staff refine draft rules for model code, what are the racial equity opportunities and consequences that need to be discussed further and potentially resolved? So I see Brock, you're up.
Yeah, and I guess this is discussion, so I can wait if anyone else has clarifying.
Thank you. Anyone have any clarifying questions? Yeah, Julia.
This might be more for the HPS section, but it is about the model code. So feel free to tell me to pause if this is the wrong section. But I just wanted to clarify that I was kind of understanding this correctly in terms of the application of the model code as a standard. So if it's being applied more as a minimum requirement, like it is for the middle housing compliance pathway versus a rebuttable presumption, am I understanding correctly that the difference there, though, is with the middle housing, that is you have to adopt to the model code exactly how it is, and then the rebuttable presumption is you can do this or equal to this? Is that the difference there in terms of the application of the model code?
I'll have to defer to Thea for that
Okay,
specific
that's what
rule,
I thought, but yeah.
all this rule is clarifying is wherever it's applied as a benchmark, it just provides the ability for local standards to be applied that achieve similar development outcomes, basically.
Okay. Thanks. I'll wait on the other part then.
We can talk about it more, but this, I mean, definitely a present question. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Other clarifying questions about the rules? Okay. Go, Brock, you have a clarifying question too?
Clarifying, and since I don't see any other hands, I guess it's a discussion too.
Fair enough.
Along Julia's point, and I think this kind of bridges the gap between the first discussion and this one. I don't think that requiring model code adoption under 200 section 3 is compliant with ORS 197. That 335 subsection 6 is only applicable upon a finding that a city failed to comply with 197.320. And that 197.320 is as operative January 1, 2025. City has a practice of violating housing laws, has a practice of disparate impacts, failed to enter an acceleration agreement, or materially breached an acceleration agreement. If this is being required to be put in really in any capacity before that happens, I don't believe that that is what is allowed by statute. Right statute to say that you have to do it, but wrong trigger, I guess is what I'm saying there.
I'm not understanding your point. So, because we wrote a rule saying 430, this is how the mandatory application works in the context of a enforcement order that's issued under 197.335.
Yeah.
That's the only time when the model code is required to be applied. There's no other time, at least my understanding of the rules,
Not
is
in your
no other time where you have to adopt or apply the model code unless you opt into it.
There wasn't previously, but the new edition of Rule 200, Section 3, which is shown for the first time in this packet, that is also direct application of the model code, which is what Julia was asking about. But that's prior.
So we're gonna talk about that in the.
Talk about that later. My understanding is that's the previous rule where we're talking about using the model code as a benchmark for like HPS compliance or housing acceleration agreement compliance. That's a different thing.
Oh, okay. That makes a little bit more sense. Thank you. Okay, a couple other comments on these few sections. The rest of them are smaller. So for 410 5C, it uses the term residentially designated or zoned lands. Just for consistency with definitions, I would recommend the zone to allow that was added in, I think it's 53 in Rule 5. The other piece there for 6D in Rule 410 doesn't trigger a requirement to update an analysis under statewide planning goals related to housing, transportation, or public facilities. I think urbanization needs to be added in there too, particularly because if you are applying the model code, which is allowed to exceed the density of the otherwise zoned intensity of that land, that would change the capacity there. So if we're saying that, like, if the intent here is to say that, hey, if you apply this model code, you're not going to have to do a bunch of extra analysis to incentivize cities to do it, I think we need to add urbanization there. The other piece, the 2 in Rule 415, one under 2A, I like the intent where this has this, but I think it would be beneficial to have an or in addition to after in lieu of there. So for example, let's say that a city says, okay, here's the model code. We're applying this here. You are allowed to use the alternative standard. But a developer comes in and says, hey, you know what, actually for the kind of project that we can put together, the recommended standard actually works better. So I think just depending on whatever the local ordinance that's adopted is, it can either be the recommended, the alternative, or, you know, the developer.
Oh, yeah, no, this one, that's actually a very important key provision, because the idea here is that recommended standards are intended to be promising practice, right? They're saying this is a standard that is kind of best facilitating of goals. Say, for example, we navigated this with parking, right? We were trying to decide, hey, a lot of small local governments really consider parking to be like a poison pill. Like, even though it would be best to reduce the amount of parking that's required, if it's never used by a small city because that's a step too far for them, it won't be used, right? So we said, okay, well, we'll make this recommended. So that way a city can say, all right, well, we'll adopt this, but we really want to have those parking requirements and we're going to specify something different. And so that rule says, okay, what you do in those scenarios, if you're going to adopt something different, you have to specify that in the adoption ordinance about what standards actually apply in lieu of that recommended standard. Otherwise, it's just kind of the default thing that applies. You wouldn't be able to establish that functionality of saying the developer can choose between the recommended or the locally applied standard without kind of reintroducing that poison pill for the city, right? So that's kind of the navigation and compromise there. And the effect of taking that recommended standard and giving the developer the choice to just apply that instead would mean that a lot of cities would be like, well, we like this, but we don't like this part, and therefore we're not going to adopt it because we don't have control over what the outcome is.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
The last one, 415(1)(c), city can adopt a module or modules to allow one or more housing types that meet or exceed the allowed density or intensity of the land zoned currently. So under this, a small city, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a problem, but could theoretically apply the large city multi-unit housing module in a otherwise, let's say it's like a really small city, like, you know, a sub 10,000 in Tillamook County that like just chose to opt into the program, right? That is an action that they could take theoretically to increase development capacity by applying the large city multi-unit standard in their low density residential zones.
So it enables you can always add more housing types or upzone, but you can't. The one thing that it does preclude is, like, let's say you have a multi-unit zone that has a minimum density standard. You wouldn't be able to allow things that are below that.
Okay, so I think something somewhere, and maybe it already exists and I just didn't connect it, but needs to say that, like, okay, doing something like that, taking the large city multi-unit and applying that to your low density residential zones, that is not something that can be considered an action as far as what is reasonable to accommodate that housing need. They could do it if they choose to. I'm not saying that they can't or shouldn't. I'm just saying that I think, when we get into the point of like, okay, is their HPS going to be challenged? Part of that could be, well, they could do more to, add more multifamily housing on existing lands by applying the model code here. And I don't think that's the intent of where the department was trying to go. And I don't think that's the intent of where the bill was trying to go either. So not a note that it's necessarily a problem, just that there needs to be some kind of consideration of saying like, hey, you can't ask them to just do something like, something that we have specifically developed for these larger cities. You can't say that by not doing that, they're not demonstrating that that need can be met in terms of land.
Understanding is the rules that Thea is talking about talks about what's necessary to comply, not these rules.
Right, but if we get into a situation where a city says, okay, we think we've done enough in terms of residential land use efficiency and we need to expand our UGB to add this many more acres for this many more units of housing at this density, right? They should not be able to be challenged on the grounds that they could, instead of expanding, have just applied the large city multi-unit module to all of their low density residential zones.
I mean, HPS decisions can't be challenged, so that's one piece. So like it's not subject to appeal. The second piece is if they meet the rules that say, hey, here's how you plan for your housing needs, then they've done it. They've met the rules, and DLCD will approve it. If you're talking about the UGB piece, I think that's more of a CalTAC discussion about like what a land use efficiency measure is and that type of thing. If a city like wanted to, for example, make an overlay zone where they apply, say, the multi-unit model code ordinance, that type of thing, why shouldn't that? I mean, if it does increase
Oh, yeah,
capacity.
exactly. Yeah. No, that's what I was, okay. I'll make that a CalTAC discussion then. Thank
Great. Thank you. Julia, thoughts about model code?
Yeah, just briefly wanted to say glad to know that there's that piece in terms of defining clarification on how a city can comply if they are wanting to do something like the model code, but not the model code exactly. Just want to note that because I think that's like really important to do wherever we can throughout this and ONA is just really giving cities a roadmap for success so that we can then focus our time on other areas as needed in terms of conversation and dialogue. So just noting that, hope that continues to happen in other areas too. And then this was, I think, brought up in the HPS part of the commentary and the rules, but just bring up here because it's related to model code drafting. There was a conversation or a question, I think, around kind of social equity and racial equity considerations in terms of utilizing the model code while acknowledging that it has relatively limited requirements or standards around landscaping and outdoor space, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to both say, yes, that is something we should be cognizant of in terms of access to green space and not having to live in areas that have high heat island effect and things like that. And I really like that the model code, though, is not overly prescriptive about those things because I think that is very hard to do at a state level model code, given how much those types of requirements, outdoor space, landscaping percentages, all of that really depend on like standard lot sizes, what you want to build on the site, which is not consistent across the state. So I wanted to flag that if this pops up as a priority in terms of wanting, though, to have a little bit more around that. I think focusing those types of things on setting outcomes and goals for like landscaping and outdoor spaces versus like a prescriptive, like this is a percentage or this is the size or whatever that you have to have, or those things, I think might be a good way to frame that to just stay out of the overly prescriptive realm, but still achieve those equity goals that we're considering.
Get on that point or just parse that point out a little bit more. I just want to make sure I'm understanding because the model code does have requirements for, right? And so are you saying more that in the application of this as a benchmark that it's ensuring that whatever is the provision that is adopted by the local government doesn't like, for example, forget that we have open space requirements, right? And so it's just all like building or asphalt, for example. Is that what you're saying?
There was a question very specifically posed in the commentary of the rules document, just acknowledging that because the model code is focused on being less restrictive as a whole, that might potentially result in certain types of housing that folks of certain incomes and races have access to, having less access to landscaping and outdoor space. Which again is a very fair thing to call out, I think, and is the reality. And I wanted to just, voice that I think the model code is towing that line well currently. And if there's a desire to kind of marry those two issues a little bit more to do it as more of an outcome versus increasing the prescriptiveness of the model code.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. So, and let me know if you think this might be a way of approaching this. So what the rule says right now, this is a technical point, is that when we're talking about design standards, is that they have a comparable proportionate cost to development as provided, and it points to actually a rule that we developed for middle housing, ORS 660046 is at 235. Basically the alternative siting and design standards. And what that is saying, hey, we have this public benefit that we want to achieve, right? And so we're going to impose standards, but we're going to outline what we expect those costs to be, right? Like what's the effect on the cost of, like cost of land, how much land you have to use, X, Y, and Z, and basically demonstrating that the proportionate cost for what public benefit is achieved, is proportionate to the costs that are imposed on development, right? That's basically the way that rule works. And the idea here is that if you're going to be applying something different, it's totally fine. It's just we want to think about making sure that comparable proportionate cost in terms of like how much cost we're putting on development compared to the public benefit it achieves is proportionate to the model code, right? So if you need to think about, say, for example, like access to green space or, that type of thing for residents, that type of thing, there's flexibility built into that code, provided you're thinking about and actually analyzing the actual cost it imposes on development rather than just being like, well, it's necessary, so we're going to do it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think on that I'll say my gut reaction is yes, that's the right way to go. I might think on that a little bit, and I recognize that maybe some of this above and beyond conversation might solidly live in the HPS realm, just related to affirmatively furthering fair housing and fair housing issues that ONA have to address that the model code doesn't directly have to do in the same way. But yeah, just wanted to connect those dots while we were in model code land, and then we can lean into this more in HPS land if it makes sense. So yeah, thanks.
I think there's a big opportunity here for guidance documents. Maybe it is the HPS guidance documents to highlight these areas of model code that aren't real prescriptive, but you need to think real hard about how it impacts and who it's impacting. So thank you for bringing that forward, Julia. Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple comments about specifics in the model code and then trying to tie it back to the HPS and kind of all the way back to what Mary Kyle had brought up. But I was looking at the differences between the large and medium cities, and there isn't a lot of difference between those cities. It's really mostly just the FAR maximum. And so it just seems kind of odd that there isn't a little bit more differentiation even in building height. I mean, the minimum densities are the same. But then I had a thought, then I was looking at the outdoor area, since we're just sort of talking about that. We have had pushback from affordable housing developers about, some of the outdoor space requirements and the balconies, especially because of the maintenance issues with those and the water infiltration, and then also just, management of visual junk and stuff like that and safety issues. So I was thinking about the outdoor space and what would be less restrictive than 15% of a site area. Or if we were more restrictive, would that be less open space area or more open space requirement? I don't know what's more restrictive in that case. It's easier to look at height and density, but you could kind of go both ways on that. And then because the model code, and I know this is in the rules, are about housing types and not by zone. When we go back to looking at the HPS and the compliance, we're really looking at areas zoned for residential uses, and it should be residential and mixed uses. It's a little confusing because we're talking about applying standards to the residential area, but a zone may allow for a variety of housing types. And so it just starts mixing it. We could figure out how to do that, but because we're looking at standards for certain housing types, and then we actually have standards by zone, and within a zone, we don't necessarily, having different standards for different uses within the zone could get confusing. Not that we would do that, but I think it's a little confusing in all the language when we talk about buildable land. We say buildable residential land. Well, buildable land is already defined, and it would just be a lot easier if we just say buildable land and take out residential. And back to Mary Kyle's point, you could say, for example, 50% of buildable land zoned to allow residential uses, not necessarily residentially zoned land, that allow the multi-housing or whatever. And that might, because we should focus we allow housing in all sorts of mixed use zones, of course, because they're mixed use, but now in our climate friendly areas and some of our commercial zones. And I haven't thought through, you know, unintended consequences of having to apply something 50% or 100% or whatever, but I feel like the word residential is in there a lot, and we need to just take into consideration that needed housing and buildable lands already kind of address where housing can be built. So I just think it would be clean up the language a little bit. And then again, it ties back into, well, standards in the model code are being required to be applied through the compliance pathways. So there is sort of a connection back. And anyway, I think we need to think about that, because we are really looking at uses within a zone. And then, you know, not having all these different standards for heights and stuff by housing type.
I think that's like part of the impetus for that particular rule of is it 430? I'm not used to the new numbers yet. Around that kind of comparative outcomes, because we know that there's limitations in the code. Like, we were directed to produce it for housing types. We don't have flexibility on that point, right? And so we have to produce a code that works in all contexts, that is differentiated by housing type. So it's not a zoning code, right? And that means the standards have to be, you know, distinguished between different housing types, and they're based on basically comparable development typologies that we've seen. And of course, we've gotten a lot of actual site plans from folks now that we can start to cross compare. We actually, and thank you guys for your work on this too. We actually got like probably around 100 or so different site plans, which is going to be great to be able to dive into. But I think in the context of, like, if you're talking about the compliance pathways, which Theo will talk about a little bit more, it's saying like, well, hey, these are not the precise standards that you have to apply. What we're talking about generally is like development outcomes in terms of the relative scale, intensity, and, you know, comparison in terms of cost and delay that local codes can provide, right? So local codes can approach it from a zoning perspective and apply the model code as a benchmark with flexibility, built-in flexibility, so they don't have to apply the very specific standards that are in the model code, right? That was pretty explicitly designed to get at that particular concern. And so, you know, I do want to emphasize that. I think that's just kind of an important point. And, you know, to the extent that we can make that more clear in that rule, we're happy to do so. But that is the intent.
Yeah, and can I jump in real quick, Deb? Absolutely agree with what Sean just explained there, and acknowledging that the language in the HPS section that applies these model code standards is definitely work in progress. So, you know, like these types of specific suggestions are really, really helpful. And, you know, we'll have a longer conversation thinking through how to sort of navigate setting these as benchmarks, you know, rather than specific adoptable actions. So yes, I hear all of that and agree. So we'll jump into that in a few minutes, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Brock, if you can make it brief, and then we'll take a little break. And
yeah, I'll be very quick since I've flagged this for Sean before, but just since Anne mentioned it in her comments there. With Senate Bill 974, I'm not sure how exactly to update that with the model code. If it's like a star only applies, you know, to for things like the porches, because I know that's one of the things that's required to not be included in residential design standards.
There's some asterisks, like there's a lot of things that are going to have to change in the code between now and the end. Like the entire middle housing land division section is going to have to change. We have different procedural requirements that are going to have to change. There are different, you know, regulations that apply for different housing types that we're going to have to change. We have to figure out how to square the circle of 2138 before we actually have adopted rules. So that's something we're going to have to figure out. All of these, 974 is an example of one as well that we're actively thinking about and going to incorporate. It also establishes a statutory definition of design standards, which will probably require conforming rulemaking. We're aware of all the post 2025 session bills that and considering how they intersect with the model code.
Thank you.
Stay tuned on that. Thank you. And just want to acknowledge, I know Brock, you mentioned it, and Anne, you also mentioned the language around residential zoning versus zoning that allows residential uses. I saw some nodding heads. So I'm sure that'll be looked at more closely. With that, let's take 5 minutes. So come back at 10:37, and then we'll dig into the HPS action selection rules. Thank you. All righty, I'm back. Is anyone else back? Sean's back, great. Thank you, Brock. All right, thank you for those giving me some feedback. That's always helpful. Thea's gonna give us an overview of the rules regarding the HPS action selection, then we'll have discussion. I do want to flag from the model code question, there was a question embedded in there that was sort of this blend between model code and HPS action, which is what do we do with the other regulations that aren't in model code, but in fact impact development. So we can pick that question back up as well in this discussion. But with that, go ahead, Thea.
My mouse is like extra slow today. Thank you for sharing the screen, Maddie. Yeah, I'm glad to be able to get into those conversations. So I can tell that there's a lot of thoughts about how, how this connection between the model code and the HPS. So first, I want to start with an acknowledgement that the rule construction in this section is particularly kind of scrambled. It has been updated since it first went out. So if you refresh, click on that link now, you'll see it's at least a slightly sort of more organized numbering scheme for that. That makes a little bit more sense. But largely, let's just not focus on the rule construction. Definitely would love to hear your thoughts and ideas, but maybe do that in writing. I think for the purpose of this, let's just focus on the content and the policy outcomes that these rules are trying to achieve. I think I also want to say that, I guess I'll start with, pulling back the housing production strategy, what it is, what it's intended to do. It's a plan of action to address the needs. So both the key needs and all the other needs that were identified in the CHN. Like the compliance pathways in the CHN, these rules that are proposed here are distributed across levels of prescriptiveness. And so I'll walk through these new provisions one by one, but I'll try to be kind of quick so we can have a good discussion. Most of these new provisions do point to the model code. So which, as we just discussed, set sort of a benchmark, something to compare your code to if you're a city. I'll say that these rules are largely an operationalization of ECHO's proposal that you all saw, which should be relatively familiar. ECHO's proposal was written in a way that sort of directly applied the model code as a standard, as an adoptable set of standards. So we are doing some sort of language shifting and negotiating to make it clear that we're going to be looking at outcomes rather than potentially like a specific action that a city has to take, but to standards that a city does have to reach is what we're going to be looking for. So just thoughts there are great, but do know that that's not, we haven't fully landed that plane. Let's see. A couple other reminders before we jump into this. There's still plenty of room for movement here. Again, it was really largely just operationalizing what we got from ECHO to see how that worked in rule. So I think there's, here maybe even more than in the CHN section, there's a little bit of room for conversation in terms of where these are going to land. Again, also, this is only a partial satisfaction of the HPS following these compliance pathways to achieve these to achieve these land use actions. Cities also still have to select non-land use actions based on their local need that responds to needs that are identified that maybe cannot be responded to directly through land use actions. Okay, finally, and I just committed this crime, a note about the language. The team has colloquially been referring to the actions in this section as land use actions, which really has no definition in rule or statute. So we reviewed this with the urbanization team, and it kind of became clear that what we were calling land use actions are essentially identical to land use efficiency measures. So you will have seen that language in the rule document. We're trying to shift to calling these all land use efficiency measures to make sure that line is drawn very clearly throughout the Goal 10 program, and just to stay consistent and clear. So this just kind of provides, this slide provides a high level visual of where these have landed for the moment. And we can go to the next slide, Maddie. So we'll start here with minimum standards. As ECHO's analysis demonstrated, despite statewide legalization, there's still sort of significant local barriers that remain to developing middle housing. So what this provision does is liberalize the standards for this type of development, which their analysis showed to be sort of the most feasible to develop in areas that currently allow middle housing, which are all residentially zoned lands in the cities that we're talking about. ECHO's analysis, showed that this is really the most feasible type of development across the state, so it's a good lever to pull here. Also, I think the rule is in line with the spirit of HB 2138 and largely seeks to sort of correct the course on how middle housing is being implemented in the state. You know, how exactly rulemaking for 2138 works with this already implemented is another question for another time. Yeah, I think one key question, and Julia, you got to it, that I do want to highlight is how sort of this broad swath application of these standards will impact design choices that support livability, and if there's potential that they will impose unintended consequences on communities of color and other low-income or marginalized communities. And also, you know, if there are mitigating actions that can help to balance out that requirement if we go that direction. We can go to the next slide. So the other minimum standard in these draft rules is a relatively small one-time change that simply allows cities to calculate density with bedroom count rather than unit count for affordable housing specifically. So what this does is it incentivizes larger or family household size units. Yes, there's that word family. And you know, I do think we want to shift to maybe larger household units. Agree that we're trying to remove the word family from the rules where we can. This gives credit toward their density goals by counting bedrooms, and essentially incentivizes larger units that are available at a lower price point. We can move on to the next slide. So as we reflected in the notes, and you guys will remember if you've read, multi-unit housing is, you know, obviously critical to meeting Oregon's housing need. Like the middle housing provision, this one sets standards that align with the model code. So if a city chooses not to rebut, it either has to sort of meet those, use those model code standards, or other standards that are comparable. On a specific percentage of land, in this case, you know, 50 of residential zones that allow this type of housing are 100% of development ready. Or they may implement a smaller city's model code to cover a greater percentage of land. And I'll say this is one where staff have some big questions, and we've heard a lot of feedback about, but really want to take a moment to highlight this question here, this does not actually expand the land on which multi-unit developments are allowed. It only sets standards that align with the model code, which sort of loosens the restrictions in specific areas of the city where they're already allowed. So should that expansion be included as part of this provision is one question here. Another question is, the way this is set up is it provides several options. It's already a rebuttable presumption, and it does already, and it also stacks options within the kind of core requirement. Is that it's flexible, and I think that is part of the goal here. Does it provide too many options? Does it sort of set cities up to do some kind of burdensome code hunt? So curious to hear what your thoughts are about which direction to go. If this type of construction is too complicated, or if it provides needed flexibility. We can go to the next slide, Maddie. Okay, so since the exercise here is focused on land use measures, as Echo pointed out, there's sort of limited interventions available as compliance pathways through land use efficiency measures to address accessible housing need. And non-land use actions here will really be more effective in responding to the need. This is another important moment to emphasize that cities are still absolutely required and will continue to be required to respond to that need through the existing program. That said, the safe harbor does incentivize the development of properties with accessibility features per the bonuses that are in the model code. Okay, we can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, finally, there's no proposal for a compliance pathway for affordable housing. And again, I want to note this doesn't diminish the centrality of that goal as an element of affirmatively furthering fair housing or that requirement in the HPS, but it sets it up as a need that is best addressed through locally determined and contextual actions. There's no language in the rule to reflect this, but DLCD will provide guidance to adopt the incentive structure described in the model code to incentivize affordable housing there. And also just one point to pull out here is that under the current proposal, if this is included as a safe harbor rather than as guidance, it may become a requirement if a city is referred into the acceleration program. We'll talk about that, how that would work in sort of the next section. For now, let's discuss the HPS, but I did just kind of want to put that bug in your brain as we sort of talk through this. And sorry, Deb, I am finished. We can go to discussion.
Deb, you're muted.
Just talking to myself. Thank you, Julia. Thank you all. So just to recap the questions, of course, we are looking for your high-level perspectives and thoughts generally on the approach, which is, has a lot of tentacles to it here for compliance. And then also want to draw your attention to helping us further understand what the racial equity opportunities or consequences are of this approach or parts of the approach that need to be considered and addressed. And then Thea highlighted a couple of very specific questions that were in the commentary, and we want to make sure we get some thoughts on that, which is, is the multi-unit zoning action just increasing intensity of a city's existing zones, or should it also be looking at expanding land area that has residential zones that allow for multi-unit housing? And then also, is the right balance of flexibility versus complication of planning sort of in the right spot? And there might have been some others in there, but we'll pick them up. So with that, let's start with Mac.
Yes, thank you so much. I have quite a few items here, so bear with me for that. First and foremost, I want to thank you. I'm really excited, of course, about the minimum requirement around bedroom densities for affordable housing that was included in this. Thank you so much. I, again, share a lot of fond appreciation and excitement for the possibility and the flexibility that will allow affordable housing developers. If you were not planning to do so already, I think reaching out to some folks in the affordable housing development space about guidance for jurisdictions and how to implement that could be really useful. I'll follow up with some written comment about that as well. The next one I kind of want to touch on is about that affordable housing compliance pathway, or I guess, of course, rather the lack thereof. And I'll be curious, of course, to hear about how it intersects with the acceleration program, which you just previewed, and then also some of the guidance that will go out pointing towards the model code. I think that's good, but I have to admit, on some level, I do feel a level of disappointment that there is not an inclusion of affordable housing compliance pathway. For a variety of reasons. One of them being as well, like, I feel like the lack of an inclusion of that means we will be falling short of some of those racial equity goals, especially because we know about the intersection of income levels and race, and that people of color are disproportionately likely to be low income, the folks that qualify for affordable housing, and are most severely impacted and bearing the burdens of the housing crisis that we have here in the state of Oregon. Even if that compliance pathway was just pointing to some of the model code items, I think that would be an improvement. Again, I know you mentioned the guidance piece, and so I appreciate that there would at least be something. I still think that there could be more, though, because I know we've talked about in this space collectively as a group some items that are land use related. We've talked about ones that aren't land use related, but still could be worth exploring. And the HPS menu that's still in progress, like, points to some of those. And so the intersection and like connection of those, I still think could happen, and would urge the exploration of that. Like, I understand the ECHO report didn't cover it, and that's mostly because they were focusing on direct market production and affordable housing by nature, especially to reach folks below 60% AMI, and even more so to reach below 30% AMI will require some level of public subsidy, whether that's at the state, federal, or local level. And so there is the need for some local conditions to be considered. And again, understand that ECHO analysis wasn't there, but I still feel like not including an avenue there as guideposts to what jurisdictions should be planning for in that HPS step is a missed opportunity here. I think one of the ones that we could really point to, and I forget if it's in the menu or not, but is an easy no-cost item related to jurisdiction, again, is that permitting prioritization. Affordable housing has a greater risk aversion to, or sorry, affordable housing really is more greatly impacted by delays in permitting and the land use process in coordination with public works, and is less able to hedge that risk of that process being delayed than a market rate development is, in part because of how we're funded through the state, and I have to commit to a deadline with them. And if I go past that deadline, I could risk losing the funding that's been in place. I could be at risk of needing to pay back pre-development loans, which often for a lot of projects, especially in the metro area that are 40 units plus, my pre-development budgets are getting to $1.5 to $2 million. And it's a lot of risk and burden for a nonprofit to have to shoulder. To have to shoulder and carry when there are some of those risks that could keep happening that I think we can control better through the owner process here. I have a couple more comments, but I'll kind of save those and let some other folks speak, but thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Appreciate you bringing those into the room. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry that I'm circling back on this, but this is where I have that concern to a certain extent that this isn't compliant with statute. It is for the multi-unit housing because it's a rebuttable presumption. But for middle housing, and I suppose for unit size, maybe, but certainly for middle housing, having that as a minimum requirement where there's not allowed deviation from, under ORS 197.335 subsection 6, you have to have a finding of noncompliance with 197.320 subsection 13. Not a value statement, just saying that legally I'm not a lawyer, but I would assume that that is the case based on the way that the statute's written. Were that a rebuttable presumption for middle housing like it is for multi-unit housing, I think it would be fine. But as it stands now as a minimum requirement, I don't think that would be allowed. I'll circle back. I think I have a couple other things, but I lost my train of thought there.
Okay, thank you. Garland.
Hi, so I have two questions. The first is around the minimum standard for unit size and allowing minimum density requirements to be calculated by bedroom rather than by unit. My question is what guidance is going to be provided on what that looks like? Is it density times 2 or density times 2.5 equals minimum bedrooms per acre? I would hope it's not 1-to-1 units to bedrooms, because that would not be doing anything to provide for family size units.
I'm not sure if this answers the question, but there is that provision that's provided in the model code. I'm not saying that that would be necessarily the guidance that every local government takes on or whatever it looks like, but it is structured around basically basing the minimum density around bedroom counts. Of course, we expect that there would be refinement needed to it as well, but that could be an example of a source that a local government could look to. I'm not sure if that's satisfactory, but
okay, yeah. So
Thank Garland, and we'll definitely check it out. I think Echo's, I believe Echo's proposal was kind of 1-to-1. I mean, it helps in that it doesn't disincentivize family size units. You know, that I think that it's kind of looking at that negative. But great point, and Sean will look into potentially connecting it to the model code also. Go ahead, Garland. Keep going.
well, I see Mac's got his hit. Mac, do you want to continue on this thread?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to clarify because I was the one that brought this into the space in the first place and talk a little bit about what the intent was. So the prime example of what came out of this and really inspired this for me is I am project managing a project right now that we were awarded development rights from the city of Portland in early 2023. As we got started, our architect was digging into the code, came to us and was like, "Hey, did you know the site is getting upzoned in like 2 months?" To which had not been brought to us before. And so the original design proposal had a vast majority, over 50+% of 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. To now meet the upzoned requirement, we had to go from a 77 unit as planned and submitted and awarded to 96 units. That then meant we had to add an extra floor onto the building. We could not keep the same ratio of family size to non-family sized units for a variety of reasons, including voucher standards, because there's vouchers in the building and they require windows in bedrooms and in living rooms. And so that created, like, due to the site constraints and all of those other sorts of requirements that got levied on to affordable housing and the funding sources we were utilizing, we couldn't keep that mix. But in code right now, a code recognizes a 96 unit building of all studios is equivalent to the density of a 96 4-bedroom unit building. We know that in practice, though, that a 4-bedroom 96 unit building would be far denser on that site. And so the intent really being here, I could have kept if this was in place when we were dealing with this, I could have kept the original plan or original proposal at that 77 unit because of the occupancy requirements that come with affordable housing funded through LIHTC, that a single person can't have a 4-bedroom unit. You need a certain number of folks in there. And so I could go to the jurisdiction and say, hey, you want 96 units, I've got 77, but over half of these are family size units and they will be required to have a certain number of folks in them, that you will still net achieve the desired density at that site. And so this being a way to enable flexibility for affordable development throughout the state to, maybe you get close to that, what if it was just a straight unit count density requirement, but you could come in a little short, for example, of if you have a larger percentage of like 2s, 3s, and 4s, again, because of those occupancy rules that come in place there. Does that kind of clarify that for you in terms of the intent? And that's why I think I want to connect with staff about guidance afterwards too, to make sure that jurisdictions understand that intent and that we don't run away with, we don't want to run into a situation where someone, like, for example, to taking it to an extreme, someone builds like a 12-bedroom unit and counts that as 12 units. I think that would be overkill. And so that's kind of the thread that I'll want to work with staff to try to thread there. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, for clarifying. So I think my question does stand because even in your example, it sounds like if the 96 was multiplied by 2 to turn into a per bedroom standard, your development would still meet it, and it would still encourage also the goal of encouraging family size units and not maybe. I mean, this is worth a discussion because this all relates to the market demand and what's the need in each jurisdiction, right? And is the need, how much of the need is for single bedrooms, how much of the need is for family size units, right? And so, yeah, I think I'd like to see a lot more clarification on how this gets implemented. But then, and I think that's related to my second question, which is I'd like to hear from staff how this proposed approach and framework considers and addresses racial equity specifically. Because I'm sure staff's put a lot of thought into that, but we haven't seen that thought kind of exposed to us and daylit through presentation materials or otherwise. So I'd just like to see the dots connected of like, in staff's view, what does this proposal do to advance racial equity and how?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Garland. And I think as we were writing it, I think I realized that a lot of that is relatively coded, and so I do appreciate the request to daylight daylight it where we can. Do you mean for this entire set of rules, or specifically for this provision that we're talking about?
I mean, I think that given that racial equity is super general, for the entire set of rules is probably more appropriate, because if it's not being covered by what we're specifically addressing today, maybe it's being covered elsewhere, and maybe you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I saw Ethan come on camera, and I'm curious if you have something that you want to jump in and say. I'm also happy to respond.
Yeah, please do, Thea. The only thing I was going to add is as part of the rulemaking advisory committee packet that is actually going out this afternoon, we include, I think it's like maybe a dozen or so pages of thoughts on how the proposed rules are addressing each of the 8 sections of the racial equity framework. So we should definitely talk about it now in this meeting, but just for you to like sit down and read something, Garland, that'll be coming out in like 5 hours. So.
And I'm also happy to include that as a follow-up, just so you guys don't have to go hunt for it, because that does do a lot of the work. And I feel torn because we have a lot to get through, and I want this conversation to be mostly hearing from you guys. But I'll say at a really high level, we frame this entire ONA. The entire ONA is structured to affirmatively further fair housing. A lot of those details are in the base rules of the HPS that are contextual, that require cities to really dig into sort of their past, the past discriminatory practices, look at their current data in terms of how housing is distributed, look at the price levels and market demand and all of that, in order to specifically respond to racial equity concerns. These rules, by nature are a little bit more flat. I think how you can interpret it is they're highlighting the need for multi-unit and middle housing. They're pulling out the vast need for housing at a lower price point, which, as we know, corresponds largely to, sort of communities of color. I think that I think that is the primary tool that these rules are relying to highlight the racial equity issue, and definitely acknowledge that it's a bit of a blunt tool using compliance pathways to standardize city response to this. And that's why we're really trying to emphasize that these land use measures are only part of the response that the city has to use to respond. So I might leave it there right now, and happy to connect. I will send out that document that we've developed that really does kind of go through rule by rule and think through like the benefits and burdens and other types of impacts to communities. But yeah, again, I don't want to take up too much time right now.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Garland. Appreciate that. Matt.
Yeah, so I know that you had mentioned that affordability wasn't really included in the subsection 3 of O200, but I also found it a little disappointing that accessible housing need is basically addressed as a safe harbor, because I don't think that making it a safe harbor is really going to be sufficient to really ensure robust actions from cities. I think it means that there's probably going to be more of a lack of accountability for meeting that need. And it's ultimately given less regulatory weight, even in this section, compared to unit size or multi-unit housing, whereas it's even being described as a dire situation, giving it the least forceful regulatory tool doesn't really seem to fit. I think that a rebuttable presumption is still flexible enough. I think, designing it would still be a challenge, but I'm also wondering, I get how it follows from the Eco Northwest memorandum, but the focus exclusively on accessible middle housing as sort of the land use efficiency measure. I kind of question why only middle housing, because it seems like there are other land use efficiency measures that could be here, like incentivizing single level housing within single family developments, or reducing regulatory barriers like parking or setbacks, because parking that's off street can reduce the amount of land and discourage accessible, like more single level type structures, or single level space, I should say. And same's kind of true with setbacks. But I'm not a zoning expert, but I think that there are also probably zoning overlays or special districts that could prioritize accessible housing. So I'm just feeling that the focus narrowly on accessible middle housing in this section seems like it could be built out a little bit more. There probably could be more ideas in there.
Thanks, Matt. And maybe missing some opportunities there. Ethan, did you have more to add on that or no? Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you. Brock, I'm going to go to Julia first and then I'll circle back to you. Thanks. Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of thoughts for this section, so I'll try and bullet point real fast, and then you can know that I'll follow up with some stuff in writing. So since I'm following on Matt's comments, I also just wanted to share those and reiterate those. And related to that, also share extreme disappointment that there's no compliance pathway for affordable housing. I don't understand the reasoning that has been provided for that. Maybe I'm just missing the point, but just that needs to be in there, in my opinion. Also, this focus on LUEMs, while I get the premise and the foundation for that, I think saying that we can't have compliance pathways for other actions is a little bit of a self-implied limitation. I say that mostly because a large chunk of the accessible housing commentary section was going on and on and on about how non-land use actions would be the solution, and then the compliance pathway is still land use based. And so I really hope we can revisit that conversation around, yes, I understand and appreciate the bifurcation of LUMs and other actions in the requirements for ONA, but the same could be said for LUEMs in terms of not providing a compliance pathway, because it will be required anyway. And so why are we not, when we know that there's like clear actions that will likely result in very high outcomes, why are we not putting those compliance pathways forward? So I really hope we can revisit that conversation to at least with some of these layer in some of those non-land use action compliance pathway options. Let's see. I think I've got my answer around the middle housing and model code piece. I need to chew on that a little bit. I do like that a lot of these are referring to the model code. Again, I kind of think leveraging things that are in the ONA family, so to speak, is valuable here. So cities kind of have some consistency in terms of what is coming to them related to ONA and then what their outputs are supposed to be related to that, as opposed to having a bunch of different reference points. This is all assuming that lands where we want it to, though. And happy to see the rebuttable presumption related to more dense housing through the model code. I think that's a good tool to have in there. And we'll just reiterate that desire, though, to see some compliance pathways that contemplate expansion of those types of zoning too, not just increasing what's allowed in existing zoning. I think those are my big ones. And then like I said, I'll get the rest in writing to you guys.
Thanks so much, Julia. Appreciate that. Brock.
Sorry. Okay. And I apologize because I'm this is you're seeing the live stream into Brock's thought process here. But so when we are saying you have the minimum standard as far as, the rebuttable presumption and the requirement to apply to, 50% of all residential buildable lands that allow multi-unit housing and 100% of development ready lands that allow multi-unit housing. If a city doesn't directly apply the model code to an area, right, then it would just be whether or not the land is zoned for middle housing. However, if a city has taken, let's say, a neighborhood that's intended to be like middle housing density, right, and they additionally apply the multi-unit housing model code to that. Let's say there's an infill lot there. And what I'm the concern here is the way that it describes applies to, and I'm sorry, I lost where I was in my rules, but applies to residentially zoned lands that allow. I didn't realize this until just now, but zone to allow actually doesn't have an existing definition based on the current CowTech rules that we have, as far as I can tell, and doesn't have one here. It references a definition in Division 24 Rule 10, which currently doesn't exist. And I just checked the CowTech packet, and it also just makes that same reference. It doesn't define it in 24. I'm not saying that there is necessarily a problem here. I'm just flagging that depending on the way that's defined, there might be some issues around if that land is, zoned to allow middle housing, but it has that multifamily housing overlay on it, and you have an infill lot there, you might be increasing price speculation for that, because the property owner, knowing that while it allows middle housing, multi-unit housing could be built there, which, while on a per unit basis might be cheaper, would be more expensive as an overall cost. And so they're expecting a higher price. And so it might create some disincentives to do that kind of infill. Again, I don't know 100% if that is the case, because I'll need to see what that definition of zone to allow is. And probably look at this for another 20-30 minutes before I can connect all the red strings, but just wanted to put that out.
Speak to that for a little bit, because there's actually studies on this phenomenon. So like when you are talking about upzoning, right, one of the concerns that can come up is around land speculation because of the increased, entitlement for property rights. It turns out, they've done some kind of digging. Specifically, there's a study at a UCLA that dives into this context and basically analyzes the economics around it. And it has to do with an environment of zoning scarcity. So like when you, for example, have very restrictive zoning, and then you take a very small targeted area and you upzone that, that's where you have that phenomenon. So like if you go to say the Alberta neighborhood or the Albina neighborhood, and like you see that kind of upzoning that happened in a very targeted area, that really increases land speculation and prices.
Right.
And
We
the
need to do it more
way to
broad.
address that is broad, right? Broad upzonings, because then there's competition for different parcels, right? I think that's just something that's important to point out. It's one of the reasons why middle housing legalization didn't really increase speculative property values, because there's so much competition in the market because it's allowed everywhere,
Right. Yeah. And that's why I'm specifically concerned with the development ready lands pieces, because then it is targeting a subset, a microcosm of that land. Right. And then if you have the assumption that that comes right. And so again, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a problem yet. I still need to like see how that definition ends up playing in. But yes, I agree with you, Sean. Yeah, that is correct.
The underlying question around, well, should there be a provision around expanding, right, where apartments are allowed?
Right. Yeah.
In part to address that dynamic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for flagging your thoughts in real time too, Brock. It's fine that it's not all perfectly worked out here. Thea, did you have something more to add on that?
Not specifically to Brock, but not seeing any hands at the moment. So thought this might be a good time to come in, and we haven't had a chance to talk about the menu, the revamped HPS menu of actions. And it went out with a packet. You guys have all seen it. And sort of in response to your concerns, Julia, I think that, the program will be further emphasizing, the use of that menu, which allows cities to, select kind of high impact actions that directly address specific needs that are not only land use efficiency measures. I know that doesn't, I hear that you have a larger critique or heartburn, and I think that, I know that's shared by, many people, also acknowledging that sort of the structure of this program, at least in the conversations that we've been having in this room, really do emphasize land use efficiency measures over all of these other actions. And I think that the way that we're trying to balance that in the rule is more nuanced than the conversation that we've been having in this room. So I do want to just kind of acknowledge that we have been super hyper focused on this set of narrow actions, but that the way that the program is structured is intended to balance that out. Not to say that there's not, there's not more, more nuance, more levers that we can pull, and definitely curious to maybe see in writing or chat with you about what specific things that you'd like to see highlighted. I see Ethan's hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks for that, Thea. I think it's a good point. I do want to emphasize a point that you were making earlier, Thea, as well, about how these compliance pathway options and the actions taken in the HPS and even the consideration of key housing needs and the contextualized housing need are only partial and should not be taken as like a city is going to take these suite of actions and only these suite of actions to meet their housing need. There's a whole other, it's only partial in that nature. And there's other both needs and actions, land use or not, that local governments will be engaging with as part of this process. And affordable housing, accessible housing, all of the other elements of the housing need that's identified in the contextualized housing need still are hanging out there in terms of needing a response in the city's housing production strategy. None of what's provided here eliminates or somewhat diminishes that obligation of local governments to take actions in response to those needs. Those are still we did that rulemaking in 2024. And we're here now to talk about, further sharpening the tools on some of these elements where it does make sense in the land use context.
And to really bring that point home, I do want to note that there is accountability built into that HPS program. And you know, that what that looks like is that there's a really deep level of department review of every HPS. And if you have been following the HPS program, especially this year, and watching sort of the decision letters that are coming out, you can see sort of how granular that review is. And you know, that it's actually not, it's not always easy. You know, that the department really does expect a high level of engagement there. And so I just want to emphasize too that, you know, we hear your concerns that these things that are not necessarily reflected in compliance pathways are not being emphasized, but really to sort of show you, you know, like show you what the inside of the program looks like to, you know, to some extent, how those mechanisms work, and these are still absolutely core priorities. So anyway, I see your hand, Anne, so I'll pass it back to you, Deb, and you can take over.
Yeah, Anne, please go ahead.
Yeah, related to the discussion around multi-unit housing and then affordable housing and how those intersect, and the requirements that we've got in the HPS and then the compliance pathways. I mean, there was a question about to us about whether to expand the percentage of land zone where which multi-unit housing is built. And I want to make sure that we don't use the term apartments anywhere, because those are different. Those can be different than multi-unit housing. But I was thinking about affordability and housing choice, and also the intersection with housing choice for our underserved populations. And it seems like this is set up to force reduce and restrict the types of housing units that might be affordable, and reduce the choices. And not everyone wants affordable housing that is only in an apartment. I mean, use that housing type. And so I just feel like with the safe harbors or the minimum mixes being proposed for the housing types, and then when we're looking at, while there isn't something about affordable housing, we know when we do our HCAs, we're going to have, you know, how many households at these different income levels. We're going to look at what housing types might be affordable to those. And we don't know what those housing types are going to be yet necessarily. And so, and then you've got on page 40 of the version of the code that I printed off the other day, you know, you've got in the housing acceleration, when you haven't, you know, done some of your actions, there is a specific measurement of housing affordability. And so I feel like housing affordability is so important, and we'll be doing that even though it's not specified as a, you know, certain type or mix. It's hard for us to then also maybe have to comply with the mixes that are now being proposed, because I don't know. I just feel like we should be able to respond to what our localized needs are. And I don't know that the end result is going to allow us to do that.
Okay, thank you for that. Mac, last comment on this, and then we'll move along to acceleration.
Yeah, thank you. I think I kind of just want to go back to the affordable housing compliance pathway and why I think it is still so important for that to be included here. Is in large part, like, yes, the existing rules that we passed in 2024 are in place. The HPS is going to need to address a housing affordability in some level within it. But I know we've also heard at the same time that jurisdictions want guidance and help, and that there are a number of jurisdictions throughout the state who don't have a lot of the staff, either capacity or expertise, to dive super deeply into understanding all the complicated metrics that go within affordable housing. And so I think that is an even more of a reason why it's really important that it gets included in this process for ONA, to help those jurisdictions who are more resource or staff capacity constrained to have something that they can plug into, that the state is recommending and showing as a North Star. I think that piece is just, I would feel, again, kind of dissatisfied if we left that on the table and didn't provide that as a resource to those folks.
Great. Thank you. Just to recap that and the other things I've heard, a desire from many of you all have spoken up that compliance pathways need to look again, take another look at whether you could find compliance pathway for affordability and accessibility, not just find, but include in rule. And that might mean actions that aren't necessarily limited to land use actions. And then also, I think what's being implied in much of the discussion is either way, there needs to be strong guidance that compliance pathways are not the end all be all, and DLCD will be, I mean, you've said it here, it's in the rules, but probably additional guidance about what your expectations are for cities to be doing all the actions to meet their local needs that they need to accomplish, not just the compliance pathways. There'll be more required of them. Okay, I'm going to move us quickly here, Thea, into the acceleration program refinement of rules. Take it away.
Thank you. And Maddie, if you could share the screen again. This will be quick. I have one slide on this. It's a relatively narrow update, but an important one. So the ways that the compliance pathways in the HPS interact with or play in the acceleration program. That's a question that we've really been thinking about and chewing on since early last year. As we're finally narrowing in on a structure for these compliance pathways, we proposed some amendments in the audit element that kind of supports both the policy objectives and the structure of the compliance pathways. So it's kind of mutually supportive. Essentially, what's in the audit now is that the department is required to determine if the code standards have been met, if those benchmarks that Sean was talking about have been achieved, and identify any barriers to their implementation. The acceleration agreement that follows has to outline actions that respond to any barriers that are in that audit. So that essentially requires the city to take action to adopt actions that use those standards as a baseline. So kind of trying to balance it leaves flexibility in how a city gets there. Like Sean was talking about, you know, there's outcomes expectation, but it provides some options for cities how to get there. Again, just pulling back to the high level, this is only for cities that are referred for having, for having a lower production kind of data. So this is, this is not for all cities. This is just for the cities that are referred, but it does have the effect of strengthening the adoption of those rebuttable presumption and safe harbor actions that are outlined in those compliance pathways. We're still talking about addition of language in the acceleration agreement that connects responsive actions to those deficiencies that are were identified. That's definitely not off the table. And I think that there's a variety of ways that we can do that, even maintaining some level of flexibility, but still maintaining the expectation of those outcomes. So that is really the only major intervention in the acceleration agreement. There's a couple other minor ones that we will be talking to you about in version 2 that I don't think change the function of the program at all, but we want to daylight where we're making other changes, but this is the only one that we have on the table for this conversation. So Deb, I can hand it back to you.
Get myself off mute. Thank you. So questions, ideas, concerns, thoughts about the refinements for acceleration? Go ahead, Brock.
One, just a drafting note for the proposed amendment in Rule 325, 6A, capital B, I, and 2I. It references Rule 204 4A and 4B, and then that second part there references 5A and 5B. Those don't exist. So just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, thanks, Brock. I think that things got
figured-
moved around.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Might have more later, but
Anyone else have questions or thoughts on the acceleration program refinements? Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, I just wanted to share appreciation for the edits and having this brought to the group since I know we haven't had a chance to chat about it yet. You've heard from us a lot about this, and so I won't go on for too long because I want to make sure other folks have the space to talk, and then we will send a couple of other comments in. But do just want to again show our support for that last piece that you were talking about, Thea, in terms of kind of completing the reference back to the compliance pathways for consistency for the cities. But yeah, thank you so much for getting these edits in here for us to review.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, for all your work and your specific suggestions. Really super helpful, and definitely interested to hear how you guys think this would, using this structure would map on. I also wanted to note that, I do see a couple of hands, so I want to get to you guys, but there's, moving, because two of these responses, two of these actions have been moved into requirements, into as minimum standards in the base program. If a city doesn't do those, they'll end up in the acceleration program just through like the normal route. So, it's just if they don't adopt them, then they go into the acceleration program until they do. So that kind of simplifies at least some of that if those are to stay in as minimum requirements. Hand it back to you, Deb.
Thank you. And just to clarify, currently those two minimum standard requirements as they're drafted right now are the middle housing type mix and the unit size. Okay, Matt.
Yeah, just a really quick comment. Under section 330, I just think that's really important, that provision that you added about all actions or replacement actions being commensurate or greater of magnitude and impacts. That's really good language, and I'm glad that you added it in there.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. Go ahead, Brock.
I guess mine, I'll tag it on to the end of Matt's there. So that paragraph G concludes with that have not been completed on schedule. So this means any actions or replacement actions included in the HPS that weren't completed, correct? Doesn't reference all on the menu. Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mac.
Yeah, I'm still digesting this section, but I do appreciate that like the circle is being connected and fully bringing back in the acceleration and accountability process those compliance pathways from earlier, the model code and the ARAs, the menu, everything like that, just to make sure that we're totally drawing the line all the way through this ONA process and making sure also the jurisdictions get to kind of know ahead of time so they can have that as a North Star when crafting to make sure that their items are going to be compliant and whatnot, but also understanding that if they fall out of compliance or refer to the audit and not performing, like just what some of the things coming down the line that would be expected of them can be more clear. Yes, that's it for right now. Again, thank you.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Brock.
So it was included both in this packet and in the CalTech packet for tomorrow. Are we going to be talking about 150 at all today?
We did not have that on the docket, but if you're, of course, welcome to submit written comment or give Thea a call.
Yeah, okay. I have written comment on it. I'll bring it up another time. Thank you.
I'm curious, since we have a few minutes time here, the jurisdictions that are in the room, anything in this section around acceleration that you have a question about or you're not quite clear on where this is headed? Or does it seem pretty clear? Brianne, maybe?
No, I don't have any questions on it at this time. Still kind of digesting it.
Yep.
For sure. I'll say that you know, one thing we are trying to balance is, you know, the way the audit is structured now is largely, you know, to identify very contextual barriers to housing production and affordable production. So, you know, this is in a way a little bit sort of it is a slight sort of deviation from, you know, from that extremely kind of contextual and, you know, sort of staff kind of work that that is required in the audit. Not saying that I don't think that there's a way to balance it, but I do just kind of want to represent that that's, you know, that is one of the concerns that it kind of diverts from that sort of very granular review for these particular actions and applies them, you know, as a sort of blanket need.
Anything else on acceleration? Yeah, go ahead, Garland.
I'm actually reviewing the updated action list, the spreadsheet that was sent out in the packet, and I'm sure this spreadsheet connects to the acceleration. I assume that it contains actions that could be included in the acceleration program. And my question is this spreadsheet still open for comment? Can we add actions to this? If so, what's the best way to add those actions? And then also I wanted to flag that it appears the description for the right to return policy doesn't match the policy. It looks like it's written for something else.
Okay, thank you for that note. Yeah, this is, I should note, and can't remember if I made this clear enough. This is very in progress. So yes, there's definitely still room for comments and thoughts about what is missing. Please send them. We are curious to see those. And it, you know, this menu is an attachment to rules, but it can be continually updated and will be. It's a bit of a living document. We're working with the Institute for Policy Research and Education at the University of Oregon, who are really doing a deep dive into sort of promising practices, different ways that these actions are being applied, if they're, you know, how to best calibrate them and how to match them up. And they will actually be developing out a set of action sheets that are, you know, sort of that provide a more in-depth description of the action that cities can use. So yes, definitely. Thank you for bringing that up. And we would love to get your all eyes on this, your thoughts about how best, you know, to create a like interface for this, and different ways that this menu can be used. But to your specific question, it will absolutely be the first thing, you know, aside from these compliance pathways, the first thing that we look for in terms of responding to barriers in the acceleration program.
Ethan, did you have something?
Yeah, just
to add
a
on?
note on the menu spreadsheet. This is really, I'll call it, I don't know, maybe it's some other number, but I'll call it 2.0 version of, or maybe even like 2.25 or 2.5 or something like that, version of this spreadsheet. The first one was pretty rudimentary. It was just cast a wide net, capture it all. If there was any resources or past examples, we included it. In some cases, we did not because we didn't have those, but we still included things on the menu anyway. And it was really back in 2020, 2021, when the HPS program was new, was just like, all right, what are we talking about here in terms of things that cities can do? And we just threw it all the spaghetti at the wall. I think the next version of this is, fitting better into the entirety of the program of, serving as a resource, serving as the first place to go for acceleration, really leaning into that tool, but also building out the individual lines in that menu for to be the true, resource that it was originally intended to be. So those things that University of Oregon's providing, those kind of action sheets, building out the descriptions, building out the, past examples, and just in addition to the actual content, making it just more user-friendly is kind of the goal here. So any comments, suggestions, feedback on how that could or should function are highly welcomed. So look forward to it, Garland.
Thank you, Ethan. And Madi put in the chat instructions on how to send comment, and not just on the rules, but also on the HPS menu you can send there.
Thank
Brock.
you. Yeah, quick jump back from to 200. This is 2B, capital B, references 200, 2BJ, and 2BG. I think those should be L and I based on the way that it was updated in the reordering. So just note on that one. For the HPS menu, and I might be opening a can of worms here, the inclusionary zoning one, I think that I am fine with the way that it talks about overall production and housing types for increasing choice, noting that if not properly paired with offsetting cost mechanisms, it can decrease production. But I don't quite understand how those two then connect in with this being a firm yes for affordability, because what we've seen in Portland, for example, which is currently the only city that's applied this, is that it incentivized developers to instead build only 19-unit structures to avoid having to go into the 99-year affordability requirement there. I think, potentially, if properly implemented, I know that's not a term that's maybe used. Well, actually, I guess maybe it is, kind of with what they're using in R7 for affordability covenants. Something more like that, I think, would make me more comfortable, because my concern here is that if a city starts falling short on affordability requirements and then says, oh, we don't actually have the money for this, but we're going to provide a 10-year tax exemption for 99-year affordability, which ultimately doesn't pencil out, we might have cities that opt to put this in place and end up actually getting less affordable housing production as a result, just based on the trends that we've seen in Portland. And I know, Shannon, I'm not saying that there aren't models for inclusionary zoning that work, because I know that we've discussed this as well. But I'm just saying, as the statute currently exists and as it has been implemented in Portland, I just think that affordability being a firm yes versus a yes if done correctly is something that should be adjusted.
Shannon.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Brock. I think that I would just like to, if I may, for the record, raise the question if many of us on this work group believe that Oregon's existing inclusionary statute is actually accidentally blocking one of our main goals of affordable housing production. Who might address that? Is that going to be left to nonprofit stakeholders? Might DLCD or the state have some role in identifying best practices? I want to acknowledge that that's not the overall purpose of this particular work group, but this is a housing actions work group. And if we're all just kind of edging around an elephant in the room, that dance gets tiresome. So I'd just like to officially raise that question, please.
Appreciate that, Shannon. I don't know, Ethan or Thea, if you feel like you're equipped to venture there, but
I do not feel equipped, and I think partially because I genuinely don't know the answer to the question of whether DLCD alone, probably the answer is no, could endeavor to make that change, and would require, conversation in a different venue outside of this, particularly at the Capitol in Salem.
Can I add to this? So, nothing in our rules can affect the applicability of ORS 197465 because we're not the legislature, right? So I think, like, for example, we have some tools that are provided in, for example, the model code, right? There's a bonus structure that includes a voluntary inclusionary housing bonus, right? That's an example of something that, like, hey, that could be workable in different contexts, all that type of stuff. But I think if we're talking about the broader paradigm of mandatory inclusionary housing policies, it's governed by 197A460. Like, period, end of story. Changes to that are going to have to be a legislatively driven initiative. We don't have control over it.
Yeah, so just, really, thank you. I just think like actually explicitly naming that is pretty helpful. So I see that. And I also really appreciate, I think inclusionary incentives are a great structure anyways, because of some market parameters. And I remain a little bit frustrated. Thanks.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to move us to concluding our discussion for the day. And as always, I like to start to sort of reflecting back on the racial equity framework for decision making in general, and specifically on the items that Thea highlighted at the beginning, which were benefits and burdens to communities that may or may not result from this rule. And then also levels of accountability and decision making, and whether and how these rules advance racial equity. And I know that staff have been working on a document that sort of summarizes some of these, but curious if anyone through the conversation today or through your reading of the rules have additional thoughts on those, or things that staff should be thinking about some more. And I know many of you have brought them up already. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, I'm not sure which of the two or another specific bucket. But the one thing that I do kind of want to flag that I don't think got discussed a lot during the beginning of this meeting, the intersection between the homeownership goal piece and the unit type mix piece. We did get some legislation through to help with, condominium construction, but nationally, at least, almost every state is seeing a downturn currently in condominium development. And so when we're saying multi-unit housing specifically with the consideration that the units, 5 or more units that are not on separated lots, my concern is that there is a bit of just practicality. I don't even want to say conflict, but I'm going to use the word conflict because I can't think of a better term, between requiring 40% multi-unit housing and trying to get that homeownership goal up as much. Not to say that there aren't ways that those can be compatible, but just to say that if the unit type mix, quantified unit type mix with the specific threshold remains, which again, we would recommend against, I think that can potentially create some issue there. So just to flag it, but.
Yep. Thank you. That layering of goals, and then also might need to get more specific and clever. I know we already have been pretty clever on the kinds of actions that could be taken to overcome some of those challenges. Julia.
Yeah, just kind of a general comment that I did appreciate in terms of the staff commentary that was included with the red lines, just kind of calling out either questions that you had related to kind of racial equity concerns. That was really helpful framing, I think, to keep in mind as we were reading the rules, to just kind of continuously prompt some thoughts on the equity front. And so I thought that was really helpful. And also, yeah, seeing some responses as well, just in terms of where this draft has landed, which was great to see. And then, yeah, as Deb noted, I know a few of us have also raised some questions that I think still need to be addressed. And also really looking forward to that kind of crosswalk that you were talking about, Ethan and Thea, for this afternoon, because I think that'll also be really helpful to just kind of reflect back not only of the work that we've done in this work group for the past 9-ish months, but also for the last 2+ years as a whole for the owner rulemaking process, to just try and pick up those threads that I know have really thoughtfully been brought up throughout the last couple of years to make sure we haven't dropped any of the really important ones as we round out the rule writing. So kudos to all of you for tracking that as best you can too, because I know it's really hard to kind of keep all those pieces and all those balls in the air, because some of those balls had to stay in the air for like 18 months before we got to this point. And so just want to commend you on that as well.
Thanks, Julia. And also just want to acknowledge the comments that have already been made today as it relates to this sort of being very mindful, and maybe in the next draft of rules, just doubling down on making sure we're being mindful of the intersection of communities of color and people who have disabilities and people of lower incomes, and where those intersections may be playing out in housing provisions, and just making sure we're not creating some new barrier or unintended consequence. And I know you all have been focused on that, but always a good reminder to go back to that. And then, of course, we'll have more conversation at the RAC about that that sort of cross between racial equity in the sections of rules, and we can also talk about it at our next meeting as well, and review that. So thank you. Any other comments before I hand it to Thea? Oh yeah, go ahead, Julia.
Sorry, I have just one other thing that I had wanted to flag, just for kind of feedback on the format as well as just forward looking. So I think this format was a lot easier to read than the draft rules that we got last year. I know that was something that you guys were working on, so I really appreciated this update. One thing I did want to note was I thought there were a lot of really good questions that were posed in the commentary that would have been nice to pull into the agenda, so that we could have kind of directly responded to those in our comment. I was doing my best to track them in my notes, but I'm sure I missed some things too. So just for future, whenever you guys do have things where you're like, we'd love feedback on that, let's get that in the agenda so we can give you feedback.
Fair enough.
But yeah, really good work across the board on conveying all of that to us. It made it a lot easier to read this time around. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Credit to Jenna Hughes, who came up with this genius new way to do it.
Nice.
Yeah, shout out Jenna. I think in terms of just trying to wrap the dot the I on the racial equity framework for decision-making piece. So I'm wondering, I think typically we send out a post-meeting email and hoping to probably get that out, I don't know, maybe even before we publish the RAC packet. But I think we can include a link in that, just doing a little bit of like logistical stuff here, Deb, and
that's
folks with
helpful.
Thea. And yeah, 18 pages, I double checked, so fairly comprehensive. So.
Great. Well, lots of eager readers here, so thank you. We'll be able to include that. Thea, do you want to recap where this is going next? And
yeah, and I did not do a next step slide, but it's sort of that the timeline is listed in the memo that you all got with your agenda, so keep rid of that. We're going to the RAC next week, a week from today, with this set of rules, and maybe the packet goes out today, so just tiny updates. So you will not see the results of this conversation reflected in that packet, but that doesn't mean we are not working it in. We'll present, sort of an overview of these draft rules to the commission at the end of September, and the Secretary of State notice, where we actually have to sort of nail down the rule format is due on October 1st. Yeah, go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, just because we've got the luxury of time, just want to highlight the commission meeting will not speak to the next version of proposed rules. Rather, it'll speak to the forecasting the policy, discussions and forks in the road that we've encountered in this process. The latest version of published rules for LCDC to consider is the version that will go out today in the Rulemaking Advisory Committee packet. So we won't, when we are sitting down with commission at the end of September, we're just going to be 2 or 3 days before the new rules get published on October 1st. So we'll be speaking in more higher level policy terms. So in case anybody's wanting to attend that and speak specific to rules, just know that commission will not have an updated version of rules that you should be commenting on at that point in time.
The other thing that we hope to highlight in that commission meeting are these points of contention, these exact conversations that we are having in this room. So we're really going to be sort of trying to daylight where, where we have heard different ideas from all of you and what kind of decision points are there to share with our commission. So yeah, version 2 of the rules will go out October 1st with this with the Secretary of State publishing. That is not the end of public comment. However, we will still be making refinements all the way through November 7th, which is the drop dead date for public comment. So welcome any kind of public comment that you may have, or staff to staff comment before that point. There is our last TOG meeting on October 15th, where we'll be talking about those version 2 of the rules. Then in December 4th or 5th is the adoption hearing for those rules. When's the public hearing? Oh, the public hearing is October 23rd. That's an important one. That's a point when you guys can show up and really make your voices heard.
All right. That's again, Madi, thank you. Pasted it in the chat. It was also in the cover memo for today's agenda, so you can always go back and find those dates. And then if you're having a hard time finding any of those, you can always reach out and we'll help you out with that. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your attention to the details and ideas, and I know more comments are coming. So please keep those moving along, and we will get you a follow-up email either today or first thing tomorrow with a link to the racial equity assessment as well. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks. Good to see you all.